Okay. So I just wanted, first of all, hope everybody is well. I just wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping things. Next week, we're going to have class on Tuesday and Wednesday. As far as I'm concerned, I don't know what you're doing with skills, but Tuesday and Wednesday we'll be doing classroom. So Monday night, you do not have class. It's too many nights in a row, to have 4 nights in a row of class. So we'll meet next Tuesday, Tuesday and Wednesday, and we're going to be mainly doing anatomy and physiology and stuff like that. So, and we'll talk more about that tomorrow night. And I'm working on trying to make a reading list so you'll know every night, what you have as far as reading and stuff like that, because I know that's something that's confusing for people. Just let me make sure that no one is emailing me that they're having problems getting in. Okay, so I'm going to shut my email off. And let me just make sure that nobody's texting or having problems. I can't log in. What is the ID and password? Did you get the invite? It's all on there. Let me just open up the information. You could click on that link and it should take you in. The meeting ID is 827-1666-4672. Period. And the passcode is either 575152 or capital VNS. Okay. Okay, we're up to 30, so we should be close. Okay, so let's do some housekeeping stuff. So everybody can see the page up that says Dropbox EMS Training EMT Original? Yes? Guys, you hear me? No? Hold on.
I can only see you on the screen. That's
Okay,
about
hold
it.
on. Let me just see. Can you see it now?
Now we lost you. There we go.
You got the Dropbox EMS Training?
Yep.
Okay. Just make sure there's no one else trying to sign in. Okay. Okay. So today by WhatsApp, I sent out a link to a couple files that I thought would be helpful as far as review goes. Not that it was something you needed. Some people thought it was stuff that they needed to do before class. I would never do that to you, send you stuff half an hour before class. But what I have done is a lot of the lectures are pre-recorded. So I sent everybody a link to this Dropbox account. And if you have a second, you should go through it and look at what's helpful for you. So the files I sent you today are out of this folder called Narrated PowerPoints. And just opening a little slow. but basically every chapter that I could get to that I thought was important, I already narrated the lectures. So for some reason, there's stuff that you didn't get or didn't remember, you could always go and review this way. So I sent out the ones that we've done already and ones that are coming up, and they're both in MP4 format, so you could play them on your phone while you're driving and stuff like that. And also, if you want to look them on your computer, if you have PowerPoint on your computer, I put them in PowerPoint form. So they're all there. And just there's a ton of information here. All the classes that we've done previously are recorded audio and also video. I mean, the video is not anything exciting. It's just me standing there. So I wouldn't waste your time, but all the audios of all the classes are there and they're labeled what they were. So if there's anything that you're confused about, you want more help with or anything like that, that's a good place to first start. Okay, so if anybody didn't get the link, then just text me tomorrow with your email address and I'll send it to you again. But that's, that was one thing that I sent out that I think would be helpful to people. Okay, so any questions on that? Okay, did anybody able to use it? Was it helpful at all? A couple people texted.
Yeah, it's very helpful.
Okay.
It's very good.
Okay, now a few of you, probably about 10 people have called me, texted me, had questions. They were all very good questions. So please don't feel like you're bothering me. If you have a question or anything like that, just reach out to me. I may not be able to get to you, immediately, but I'm good about getting to you by the end of the day. So if there's something you don't understand or, something you just want to discuss, then just feel free to, send me a text, send me a WhatsApp or something like that. And I'll get back to you. If it's something simple and you want to actually include what your question is, right in the text, that would be fine too. And I'll, answer you back by text. And if that's not enough, then we could talk in person. Okay. Okay. So does anybody have any questions for me on what we covered the last time we were together? Now, I am recording these lectures. So if you, hold on, somebody has a chat. Okay. Yeah, if you have a question while I'm teaching, just interrupt. Just unmute yourself and interrupt because it's hard for me to see the chats and stuff like that. So, but if you, what was I just going to say? The actual class from last week is up on YouTube. So if you just go to YouTube and put in my name, Frank Deschino, you'll go right to my YouTube page, and then that lecture is there, plus a whole bunch of other different lectures and stuff like that. And I'll record every night, so that if for some reason you miss it or you want to go over anything that we discussed, it'll be there. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to take this off now. Just bear with me for a second. I'm trying to. There's still people joining. Okay. Okay, so does everybody see emergency care, chapter 4, medical legal up there?
I can see it.
Okay. Okay, so what I'm going to try to get through tonight will be the chapter on medical legal, the chapter on terminology, and we'll see if we can actually start some anatomy and physiology also while we're doing it. And like I said, I'll give you breaks. If it's too much, if we're going too long without a break, just, somebody will mute themselves and just tell me that you guys need a break, and I will, give you a break. Just want to make sure I'm not missing anyone. Okay. Okay, so people just keep on coming in. Okay, so when we talk about medical legal stuff, the reason that we're talking about it is that it's the part of what we do that could jam us up, right? So we're treating patients, and just like a doctor can be sued, we could be sued. And it doesn't matter if you're being paid to do it or not being paid to do it or anything like that. If you're treating a patient and you're an EMT, there's expectations that you know what you're doing. And so we have to operate within a set of guidelines. And I'm going to go through that now. It's not the most exciting part of the class, obviously, but it's something that we need to talk, and there'll always be a couple of questions on the exam for it. So there's some terms that are a little confusing. There's something called scope of practice, and then there's something called standard of care. And they both mean something, but they kind of sound alike. So scope of practice is basically what we're allowed to do as EMTs. Okay, so let's example, administer oxygen, administer epinephrine if somebody's having an allergic reaction. So your scope of practice is basically what you're allowed to do as an EMT. Now, in New York State, there's no document that says EMTs can do A, B, C, and D. It's just, they base it on your training, your classroom training, and what we call protocols. And when we talk about medical legal stuff, we're going to talk about protocols. Protocols are written guidelines that we follow when we're treating patients. Okay, so they base the scope of practice of EMTs in New York State on what they call scope of practice. Okay, the scope of practice based on protocols and your training. Okay, so other states actually have written guidelines, and say EMTs can do A, B, and C, but New York State is not that organized. They've never done it. Okay. Now, why it's important is we have to deliver care to a patient meeting that standard of, that scope of practice and standard of care, right? So the first one was scope of practice. That's what we're allowed to do. Now, the standard of care is basically what we're judged against. So scope of practice says what we can do. Standard of care is what we're judged against. So the standard care would say, an EMT should know how to put a splint on a broken leg. Now, how do they judge whether you do it well or not do it well? Is that they take a hypothetical EMT, like, an EMT that doesn't exist, and they say that the average EMT, okay, should be able to apply a splint in 5 minutes without causing excessive pain or damage to the patient's leg. And if you were to get sued, if somebody said to you, okay, you put the splint on my leg, you did it wrong, and my leg's injured, they would then go back and examine what you did to see if it meets what's called the standard of care. So the standard of care is what another EMT with same or similar training to you would do in a same or similar situation. So it's not that you have to be judged against the best EMT in the world or the worst EMT in the world, the average EMT in the world. So none of this ever comes into effect unless you get sued, right? Or unless there's a legal problem. So just to go back again, scope of practice over here, right? And I'm assuming everybody can see what I'm looking at on the slides and stuff. So for some reason you don't see the slides or you don't see my mouse moving, then let me know. So scope of practice is what you can do. Okay, and that's based, we said, on protocols and your training, your education. Standard of care is how you should do it. Okay, so, and how you should do it well. Okay, now, we're not allowed in the United States to treat a patient without what we call consent. Consent is getting permission for the patient, from the patient, to do what we want to do to them. Okay. So there's different types of consent, and there's always some questions on the state exam about one specific type of consent called implied consent. But let's go through them and we'll look at all of them. So if you were to go to the doctor's office, right? The first time you go to a doctor's office, you sign lots of papers. One of the papers you're signing is actually giving consent forever, as long as you're a patient to that doctor, that they can treat you. Okay. When you go to the hospital and you sit in front of the window in front of the person, registering you in, again, you're signing in multiple places giving consent for the hospital to treat you. So consent is you allowing somebody else to deliver medical care to you. Now, in EMS, since a lot of times we're dealing in life-threatening situations, when it's a life-threatening situation is what we call implied consent. But let's just talk about, we walk in on someone and they're having, I don't know, they're having a chest pain, okay? So for you to give what's called express consent or informed consent, which is what I'm looking at on this page over here, okay, you have to tell the patient certain things, okay? You have to tell them who you are. So you have to say, hi, my name is Frank. I'm a paramedic, okay? It seems like you're having some chest pain, okay? So we would like to, give you some treatment for that to see if we can make it feel a little better before we take you to the hospital. And if your treatment can result in any side effects or anything going wrong with the patient, you need to let them know that, okay? So just if you're unmuted, just make sure there's not a lot of background noise. So going back to that chest pain patient, so you say to them, hello, my name is Frank, I'm a paramedic. Okay, it sounds like you're having some chest pain. We want to make sure you're not having a heart attack. Okay, so we'd like to give you some oxygen and some aspirin. And, the oxygen may smell a little funny. The aspirin shouldn't really bother you unless you have any allergies to it, and you already told me that you don't have any allergies to it. And so there shouldn't be any problems with it. And if they say, okay, it's fine to go ahead and treat me, then, you would. So once they give the actual say yes to it, that's actual consent. Now, some of you have ridden on the ambulance or been on the ambulance already, and you know that nobody does this. Okay, even though I'm telling you it should be done, you know that nobody really does. And, it is often overlooked, but if you were to get sued, the first thing the lawyers would look at is, did the patient consent to your treatment? And, if there's now you don't have to get it in writing, but it is a verbal thing. So the patient turns around and says, they never asked me for permission to do this, and you truly never did it, then there could be a problem. Okay. So again, express consent is that you're basically advising the patient of who you are, your level of training, what you think is wrong with them, what you would like to do about it, and if there's any side effects. When they say yes, it becomes actual consent. Okay. Now, this is the one where they have a lot of questions on the exam about. It's called implied consent. So what it means is that the consent can't be given because implied consent is if a patient's unconscious, if a patient has what's called an altered mental status. An altered mental status means they're not thinking properly. And I listed some reasons why they could be, under the influences of drugs, alcohol, ETOH is the way we abbreviate alcohol. Their blood sugar could be low. They could have a head injury. Okay, or they're under the age of 18, so they cannot give consent, or they are intellectually disabled, meaning, they have some type of problem processing information. So in those cases, the law does not allow them to give consent, but it's assumed, it's implied that an unconscious patient would want to be treated. It's implied or assumed that somebody who's unconscious would want to be treated. It's assumed that the parents of a minor would want them treated if it was an emergency, right? So this is where implied consent comes in, that the patient is not able to give consent for whatever reason. They're too young or they're unconscious, but treatment still needs to be provided, and we are allowed to treat them under what's called implied consent. Okay, so if you were to go to an 8-year-old child that fell off his bicycle and had a cut, you don't have to ask permission of that 8-year-old child to treat him. I mean, it's best to always explain to them, and talk to them and stuff like that. But, if you feel there's a treatment that needs to be provided, you don't have to technically get their consent to treat them because they're under the age of 18. So again, children, mentally incompetent adults, okay? Minors are not legally permitted to provide consent or refuse treatment, right? So we're kind of obligated to take care of them then, okay? If possible, you would want to get it from their parent or legal guardian, but obviously if the parent or legal guardian is not there, then it's called implied consent, okay? Now, the exceptions, okay? So in loco parentis, the parents is a legal term, a Latin legal term. The parents are not present. So where this comes into effect is a child going to school, okay? So the school has responsibility for the child from the minute they get to the bus stop to the minute they get off at the bus stop in New York State. That's the way it works. So if a child was standing at the bus stop and had an asthma attack, okay, and there was no parents, technically the school has responsibility for them. Obviously, there's nobody from the school there. And it doesn't really count to like the bus driver or something like that. It needs to be an administrator of the school. So we would treat them under implied consent. Let's say a different situation. There's a school bus accident, minor school bus accident. 20 kids on a bus, nobody's hurt, but it is a school bus accident. So now we have 20 kids that may or may not need to go to the hospital, their parents may or may not want them to be evaluated. So we don't have to wait on the scene for all 20 parents to come. What could happen is that a new bus, because that bus will be out of service, right? The police have to do it. If it's into an accident, the police typically impound the vehicle, and we have to wait for another bus to come. Now, if the principal or an administrator from the school shows up, he or she can technically tell you that you don't need to transport, they'll take responsibility for that child. So that's what in local parentis means, is that the parents are not present and somebody else is taking responsibility for that child. Now, what you have to be careful about is that doesn't imply like the neighbor, right? The neighbor comes over and says, oh, that's my neighbor, I'm good friends with them, I'll watch for the child. That doesn't count. Even a grandparent technically doesn't count unless the parents gave them permission in writing to be a guardian for the child when they're not present. So you got to be very careful. Like, I know in the Jewish world, we tend to be like very, trusting of neighbors and other family members and stuff like that. But from a legal standpoint, okay, they're not technically guardians unless that guardianship is given in writing. Now, the term emancipated minor refers to a patient under the 18 years of age who has the ability to make decisions for themselves. So right now we said that implied consent would mean that if a child's under 18, that we could treat them without permission. But if they're what's called an emancipated minor, then they actually have the right to make decisions for themselves. So emancipated minors, the way we would see them would be a girl under 18 who has had a child or is pregnant or has had a child. She is entitled to make healthcare decisions for herself and for her child or unborn child, right? So that would be one thing. It used to also be that if the minor under 18 enlisted in the military, they would be considered emancipated. But now the military doesn't take kids under 18, so that doesn't really count. The last time you could see somebody who's an emancipated minor is if the court decided, let's say it's a 17-year-old kid, the house is a disaster, their parents are useless. The court could decide that the kid would be better off being out from under the parents and being able to make decisions for themselves. It's very rare. I've never seen it in real life, but it could technically happen where the court could just decide that the child is mature enough to make decisions for themselves and they take them out from underneath the parents' guidance. Okay, so in children, implied consent is usually reserved for life-threatening illnesses or injuries, right? So if a kid has a minor cut on their arm and the parents are 15 minutes away, we usually would wait. If the kid had a life-threatening injury, we wouldn't wait for the parents to arrive, okay? Now, intellectually disabled adults, okay, in other words, patients who have autism or something like that, the law allows us to be able to treat them if their guardian is not present. So if their parent or guardian is not present and they cannot make decisions for themselves, we can go ahead and treat them, okay? Now, what about in a situation where we're forcing someone to go to the hospital? So somebody's having a psychiatric emergency or something like that, and we need to force them to go to the hospital. So the law allows somebody who's a danger to themselves or others to be compelled to go to the hospital. But what I would say is it's not really up to us as EMS to make that decision. If that happens, you really want to have the police involved because you could technically be charged with unlawful imprisonment, even kidnapping, if you take someone and force them to go to the hospital. I remember when I first came to Rockland County back in 1988. It was a Friday night, and we get called to, meet Hatzola. Back then, Hatzola didn't have paramedics. And the call was basically that people observed somebody driving on Shabbos that shouldn't have been driving on Shabbos. And they actually blocked the car and kind of took the guy out of the car. And I guess the guy had a little bit of history of being a little strange and stuff like that. But they basically decided, the bystanders decided by the fact that he was driving on Shabbos that he wasn't 100%. And, he needed to go to the hospital. So, this turned into a little bit of a thing. The police showed up. And basically the guy's saying, if I want to drive on Shabbos, I can drive on Shabbos. There's not up to them to stop me from driving on Shabbos. And there was really nothing pointing towards the fact that he had any kind of mental illness, even though everybody was saying that he wasn't 100%. So, technically all those people who, basically stopped the guy, dragged him out of the car, and stuff like that could be charged with unlawful imprisonment because they basically violated this guy's civil rights by, doing that. I mean, nothing happened. The whole thing, kind of got resolved. The guy just left. But you just have to be careful, okay? You also have to be very careful if you restrain someone. So restraining means that you somehow hold them down or tie them down because you think they're a risk to themselves and stuff like that. So all of that stuff should really have the police involved because if the police are involved and agree with what's being done, then obviously you can't be charged with a crime. If the police come 15 minutes later and this guy is screaming and yelling that, he doesn't want to go to the hospital and you tied him up and forced him to go to the hospital, and at that point, nothing's pointing towards the fact that your decision was right, you technically could be charged with a crime. So again, don't get involved in that kind of stuff. You see people thinking they're, psychiatrists, thinking they're police officers and all this stuff, and they're EMTs, right? So know what you know and you're good at, but don't get into other people's business and stuff like that. Now, can a patient refuse care? And the rule is yes. Anyone who's over the age of 18 and who is mentally intact, right, doesn't have any mental problems, is thinking clearly, is not sick in a way that they're not thinking clearly, can decide they don't want treatment. So, we go to people's homes. People, a typical thing, people are involved in a car accident, okay? And now with airbags and seatbelts and, well-built cars, even though the car looks like it's destroyed, most of the times the people are fine. So you go there, because you got called to the scene because people saw this accident, and you go to, are you okay? Yes, I'm okay. Do you want to go to the hospital? No. So the patient's refusing care. When that happens, we usually want to document the fact that we offered the patient the right to go to the hospital, that we would transport them. They're refusing. So there's a form that gets filled in. But the patient may say, I don't want to fill in the form. I don't want to sign the form. I just don't want to go to the hospital. I didn't ask you to come here. You just came here. I don't want to have anything to do. I don't want to sign anything. I don't want to put my name on anything. I don't want to tell you who I am. I don't want to do anything. And they have the right to do that. So we usually try to get them to fill in the form. We usually try to get them to sign the form saying that we offered to take them to the hospital. They don't want to go. But ultimately, a patient has the right to refuse. So what we try to do is that we try to say out loud in front of people that are what we call not interested parties, like the police, or other people that are there. We could say to them, listen, we think you should go to the hospital. You're in bad, you're involved in this car accident. You could be hurt. But, we can't force you to go. So if you don't want to go, we'll honor your wishes and not force you to go to the hospital. But just realize that you could have an injury that could show itself, hours later. And if that's the case, feel free to call us back. But we just want you to realize that, you're basically putting yourself at danger. Okay, so you're kind of informing that there could be a problem, and you're telling them that you would be willing to take them to the hospital, and you're telling them that you would even be willing to take them to the hospital if they change their mind, right? So, and that's kind of how we protect ourselves when patients refuse care. So, one second. People just, I guess, are getting dropped and then coming back in. Okay. Okay, so to minimize our risk when patients are being difficult and don't want to go to the hospital, or and again, there's certain situations where we know ourselves patients don't need to go to the hospital, but I'm talking about in situations where you really think that the patient needs to go to the hospital and they're just don't want to go. There's nothing you could do to convince them, that they should go to the hospital, something like that. So what do? You spend some time speaking with them. You don't want to overstay your welcome and get them aggravated. Okay. Try to listen to why they're telling you they don't want to go. And maybe you could then explain to them why they should go. Okay. And then if they're still refusing to go, you just inform them of the possible consequences. So you have a patient who's having chest discomfort, but they say, oh, it's my stomach. It's not my heart. I don't want to go to the hospital. So you explain to them, listen, there's no way to know in the house whether it's your heart or your stomach. We need you to take you to the hospital to have you examined by doctors to know that. And if you don't want to go, we can't force you, but just realize that if you are having a heart attack, every minute matters, and that you could be damaging your heart to the point where you could die from it. So if you're willing to accept that risk, then I guess there's nothing we could really do. But if at any point you change your mind, feel free to call us back. And you just, because what happens then is if something does go wrong, the patient's not going to turn around and sue because he or she realizes that you've done everything you could do to kind of convince them to go. Okay, now, if you really, really, really have a patient you think should go to the hospital and they're just refusing to go, probably the best thing you could do and the safest thing you could do is actually call what we call medical direction or medical control. Medical direction or medical control is that the emergency room doctor has to be available to us to consult over the phone with us if we need direction on what to do. So if you have this guy who you think's having a heart attack and he's refusing to go, you could say, I'm going to call the emergency room and put you on the phone with the doctor so you could discuss it with him. And then you would call the hospital, explain to the doctor, we have this 57-year-old gentleman who has chest discomfort times 2 hours. He doesn't want to go. We've been trying to convince him to go. Could you please talk to him and tell him, that he probably should go to the hospital? And then technically they should get on the phone and tell that patient, listen, the EMTs are right. You need to get into the hospital. If he still refuses, think about what just happened. Our job, right, as EMTs is to take a patient to a doctor in the hospital. This patient is refusing to do that, but you still went beyond, right, what anybody else probably would do, and you put that patient in contact with a doctor. So your liability is almost non-existent at this point because you did everything you could do, including putting the patient, in contact with an emergency room physician, and he's still refusing to go. So if something goes wrong and he sues or the family sues or something like that, and it goes to court, right? What are they going to argue? They're going to say to him, did you speak to the emergency room physician? Did the EMTs arrange for you to speak to the emergency room physician? Well, yes. Okay, did the emergency room physician tell you to go to the hospital? Well, yes. Did you still refuse? Well, yes. And that's it. It's not going to go anywhere. In fact, it would never even go to court because once the other lawyer finds out that his patient was in contact with the emergency room physician and still refused to go, he's going to know there's nowhere to go with this. And, it's going to be done. Now, when we call the hospital, we tape all our calls. We call through a special number and we tape all our calls. I don't know if every, little volunteer ambulance does that, but it's always best, obviously, to have a tape recording of the conversation so that if anything ever goes wrong, there's a way to go back and play it back, to the patient. And if the other lawyer, realizes the whole conversation was taped, it also would make it less likely that they would proceed, with a lawsuit and something like that. Okay, so we do whatever we can to convince the patient to accept care and go to the hospital. Okay, now let's ask some questions here. Okay, so what are the risks of beginning treatment or transport without getting a consent of the patient? Right, so you basically walk up, there's some guy sitting on the floor, okay, and it looks to you like he may be having trouble breathing, and without any real conversation, you just kind of pick him up, put him on a stretcher, put him in the ambulance, and start treating him and transporting him to the hospital. And the guy's like, what are you doing? So again, the risk would be is that you legally, can run into a big problem. One, you're treating a patient without consent. Two, you're forcing someone to do something they don't want to do. And this is both a civil, like being sued problem and a criminal problem. So we just don't do it. You'd be amazed how, again, you can get new and experienced EMTs that think because they've had, 200 hours, 250 hours of training, that they're entitled to all these rights and everything like that. And it's not true. I had a case this past summer. We had a lady up in Tuxedo who called the police because they said there were men outside looking to injure her son. Police show up. There's nobody outside. The son is not home. They called the son. They said, your mother's telling us this. The son says, my mother's not 100%. There's nobody trying to injure me. She does this, and, it's nothing. So anyway, the lady wasn't saying she wanted to harm herself. The lady wasn't saying anything about herself, just that there were people outside looking to injure her son, and that was not true. So, we go, basically, are you okay? Yes. Do you want to stay? You want to stay in the house? You want to go to the hospital? I want to stay in the house. Are you going to hurt yourself? No. So there's nothing we could really do, right? She has every right to stay home. So we have her fill out some forms and we start, to drive away, and we hear the ambulance not leaving. So we turn around, go back. And the EMT on the ambulance is basically telling the lady she doesn't have a decision in the matter, that she has to walk out to the ambulance. They're going to take her to the hospital. And she's telling them, no, I'm not doing that. You can't force me to go to the hospital. And they're telling her, yes, she can. So, call the police back to the scene. And then the cop tells the EMT to leave the house now. And if he comes back to the house to bother this lady again, he's going to have her arrested. So you have to realize that there is liability if you overstep your boundaries, right? And I mean, that was an exaggerated situation of a very stupid person, but that could happen. Now, also I wrote over here, what about if the patient refuses to sign the refusal form? So patient says, thank you for coming. I didn't call you. My wife called you. I don't want to go to the hospital. Okay, no problem, sir. You understand the risks. Yes. Okay, we'll respect your wishes that you don't have to go to the hospital. Would you mind just signing this form saying that we offer to take you to the hospital and you don't want to go? No, I don't want to sign it. Well, why don't you want to sign it? I just don't want to sign it. So they don't have to, okay? And in fact, if they were to sign the form, it doesn't even release us from that much liability by signing the form. Like everybody thinks getting the form signed is like the end all of getting released from liability, but it really isn't, because if you go to court and you present that form in a courtroom and say, okay, the patient signed that they didn't want to go. What the patient's lawyer, right, the lawyer that's fighting against you, what he's going to say is that my patient wasn't able to clearly make decisions because he was sick, and you shoved this form under his hands and told him to sign it and didn't let him read it, and he didn't understand it. And look at his signature. His signature is not even his real signature, because you know that when we sign stuff, a lot of times it's very sloppy, and it's not like if you were signing the mortgage on your house, you probably take time and sign it a certain way, where if you're just scribbling your name on a piece of paper, it doesn't often match the signature. So when they look at signatures on medical refusal forms, they're usually not accurate to the patient's real signature. And again, they could always argue that since there was a emergency going on, that the patient truly didn't understand what you asked them to do. So yes, we do try to get the form filled in, but most of the times it doesn't really make a big difference in whether or not this lawsuit is going to proceed in a court of law. Okay.
You ever experienced a lawsuit or something like that?
So I only had to, like, first of all, like lawsuits, well, at least I've never been to a criminal lawsuit, but medical lawsuits are kind of weird. So the first thing is, I think they have like 3 years to sue you, right? So that's why our documentation, in other words, when we write our report up, we really have to be thorough about it, because you're not going to remember all the facts 3 years after it. So it's always good to take time to do good thorough documentation of what was going on, especially things that would be able to protect you. So like let's say we go in a car accident and patient's walking around talking on the phone, smoking a cigarette. So I always write that down. Arrived on the scene, found patient walking around, turning their head in all different directions, talking on their cell phone. And the reason I would write it is that if the patient was then going to say they had an injury, their neck was injured, their head was injured, their hand was injured, by you documenting how you found them when you showed up, you're basically proving that that was not true. So, that's it. So the case I was involved in was a guy who got kicked out of his house, and he went back to his apartment, where him and his wife lived. He went back to the apartment after his wife kicked him out, and he was basically banging on the door, asking her to forgive him and let him back in the house. And she called 911 to have the police come and, tell him to go away. For some reason, it got processed in as a ambulance call, not as a police matter. This was in Yonkers years ago. So they basically send us on a unknown medical, right? Respond to this apartment, unknown medical. So we walk up there, and the guy basically says that, my wife threw me out, and I'm trying to ask her to come back in. The wife's yelling from the other side of the door, I don't want him back in. And he seemed like a nice guy, and everything. I said, listen, what's going to happen is the police are going to show up. You're probably going to wind up getting arrested. So why don't you just leave, and give it a couple of days. Maybe she'll cool down and everything like that. So while we're conversing with him, the police come, and he decides to run. So the cops kind of, run after him, obviously, because they don't know why he's running, even though we're kind of telling them, there was nothing really terrible going on. And it just turned into like a whole big thing. And it wound up that the patient, or the gentleman, got hurt, got arrested, probably was, roughed up and stuff like that by the police. And it turned into a whole big thing. So we had to go in and what they call be deposed. So you don't actually never go to court. What happens is when you're deposed is you're in a room with your lawyer, and their lawyer has the right to ask you any question they want. Where in a courtroom, your lawyer could tell you not to answer that question. When you're getting deposed, the other lawyer could basically ask you almost any question they want, because your lawyer wants to have the ability to ask their people any question they want. So they can pretty much ask you anything they want. So, and they just ask you question after question after question because they're trying to establish what happened. So that was kind of what I was involved in. So, they asked us about, did the patient seem violent to you? Did the patient seem this? Did you, they could even say, like, do you think the police overreacted? So like in a courtroom, you can't really ask that kind of question because it's so general. But like in being deposed, they can ask you very, very open-ended questions and stuff like that. So that was what I was involved in, and then nothing ever really came of it. It kind of went by the wayside. So, okay. So when a patient refuses care, okay, so, subjecting a patient to unwanted care and transport, okay, has been viewed in a court as assault or battery, right? So we can't really do that. So unlawful imprisonment, assault, battery, and stuff like that. So, what we'd like to have is what we call unbiased, witnesses. So the police are considered, if you have a police officer present, a non-family member present who witnesses you trying to do everything you could do to get the patient to go to the hospital and they're still refusing, there's a spot for signatures where the patient signs and there's a spot where the witness signs. So having, a witness sign is always a good thing, okay? And then the last thing is always tell the patient in front of those people that if they change their mind, they could call back the ambulance. And then try never to leave a patient alone in the house. Let's say they go to somebody and they live alone and there's nobody with them and they don't want to go to the hospital and you think they need to go to the hospital, but they're refusing to go. So you can't force them. So you're going to wind up leaving them. So I always say to them, is there somebody that we could call? Is there a neighbor? Is there a relative? Is there a clergy? Somebody that we could call that could stay with you, just to make sure you're okay. And, if you can get somebody to stay with them, you could always say to that person, listen, stay with them for an hour if you can, please. And if anything changes, if you can convince them to go to the hospital, call us back. If they change their mind, if they get worse, call us back. And what you've done is you've gotten another person who's witnessing how much you've done to try to, convince that patient to go to the hospital. Okay, so again, possible have a friend or relative. Okay, and then the last most important thing is to document on your what we call a PCR. PCR stands for a pre-hospital care report. It's the paperwork that we fill out that documents the care that we render to the patient. You want to document, very thoroughly everything you've done to try to convince that patient to go to the hospital, and even include the statements they made, why they don't want to go to the hospital and stuff like that. Okay, now switching off to a different thing, something called advanced directives. So this is not real big in the Jewish world, okay? But an advanced directive is that a patient puts their healthcare wishes in writing, okay, before they need to have it in writing. So what I'm saying is that a patient says that if I go into cardiac arrest, I don't want CPR being done, and stuff like that. So that's kind of what advanced directives are. EMTs in New York State have to honor two types of advanced directives: a do not resuscitate order, which is abbreviated a DNR, okay, or what's called a medical order for life-sustaining treatment, which is called the MOLST form, okay. There's two other forms called living wills and healthcare proxies that, while they're legally binding and the hospital would honor them, we're unable to honor them in the field for a very simple reason. Both of these forms, the lower ones, the living wills and healthcare proxies, require that a physician says the patient's not capable to make decisions for themselves. And since we don't have that physician present in the field, we can't honor it. We're obviously in the hospital, there's a doctor present who could say, okay, this guy's in cardiac arrest. Obviously, he can't make decisions for himself. We're going to honor it. So even though in the field, everybody would know that a patient in cardiac arrest can't make decisions for themselves and you could honor their, their written wishes, because that doctor is not present and because the law says the doctor has to be present, we can't honor it. But we can and have to honor do not resuscitate orders and medical orders for life-sustaining treatment. Those two we have to honor. Now, I know it'll be a little hard for you to see this, okay? But this is a New York State out-of-hospital DNR form, right? And all it basically has room for is the patient's name, date of birth, the doctor who's signing the DNR order, and that's it. And it basically says, do not resuscitate this patient if they're in cardiac arrest. And end of it. They never expire. It says it's supposed to be updated every 90 days. They're never updated every 90 days. And it actually says that even if they're not updated, you still honor them. So if you were presented with a properly filled out DNR, and you don't have to verify that the doctor's the name on it is truly a doctor. You don't have to do anything. It's called good faith. If you in good faith believe the form is filled out properly, that's all that counts. You don't have to verify anything, okay? then you would, if that patient was in cardiac arrest, you would not do nothing. All you would do is call the police, and the police will call the medical examiner's office and decide if they want to do an investigation or not. And if not, they'll call the funeral parlor to come pick up the body. Now, the MOLST form, the first page of a MOLST form is a DNR order. And the rest of the pages deal with other types of care, like fluids and antibiotics and pain management and transport to the hospital. So, but we're really concerned with the front page. Do they want CPR or do they not want CPR? So again, if either one of these forms is correctly filled out and presented to you, you do not need to start resuscitation on those patients.
Where do you get these forms? Who's
We
going
do
to
not
hand
get
you the
them.
form?
We do not do this. This is the,
When,
it's
when
already
we get
filled.
to a call and someone is in cardiac arrest, who's going to hand you this form?
The family. So in other words, most of the times when patients are in, have these forms, they're in a program called hospice. Hospice is a program where patients who are not expected to live because of their illness are brought home and managed by specially trained nurses to manage their pain and stay home, okay, really don't receive, you know, advanced care, so to speak, but are made comfortable, and they basically come home to die. Okay, and the feeling is that they'd be more comfortable to die at home than being in a hospital setting. This is why I'm saying they're not big in the Jewish world, because in the Jewish world, people, you know, halakhically don't believe in that kind of stuff. So, you know, you don't see this in the Jewish world.
So a simple question. If someone signs this and you get to the call and he's in cardiac arrest, you bring him back. Can he sue you
Yes.
for bringing him back?
Yes.
But I didn't know about this. How does it go about?
So,
I didn't get the form before.
oh, that's
that.
different. So you weren't presented with the form. That's different. But if you, in other words, so there have been cases, remember, this is not just a New York State thing, but there have been cases, okay, where it was more with like the born again Christian type of people where the nurse, because they were born again Christian, didn't believe in this, right? Not that the patient didn't believe in it, the nurse didn't believe in it and believed that everything had to be done for this patient. So the patient was in cardiac arrest and the nurse discarded the fact that there was an advance directive, that there was a DNR, and tried to resuscitate the patient. The patient was saved, but was brain damaged, and the family successfully sued. So the long and short is that if the form is properly filled out and presented to you, you have to honor it and you don't do anything. And the other way it goes, you know, which is what I thought you were going to ask me, is what if you start treating the patient? Nobody says there's a form, you know, there's no advance directive presented to you, like you're in a nursing home, you know, whatever, it's chaos. They don't present it right away. You start resuscitating the patient. You start CPR, using the AED, and they show up with the form. Okay, the patient's still dead, and they show up with the form. You actually stop. Okay, you actually stop the resuscitation if you were presented with a valid DNR order. Okay, so
if you got him back and he still needs help.
Well, if you got him back, then no, you're not going to put a pillow over his head and suffocate him and kill him again. But if you got him back, because
do I have to treat him and give him more oxygen and everything like normal, or just let him?
Because a do not resuscitate order only is in effect when a patient's in cardiac arrest. So if you saved them, they're not in cardiac arrest anymore. So like if you go to a nursing home and the patient's having trouble breathing, but they have a pulse, they're having trouble breathing, right? And they present you with a DNR order. The DNR order is not in effect because the patient's not in cardiac arrest. So it only goes into effect if it's patients in cardiac arrest, because it's an order to withhold CPR. It's not an order to withhold oxygen in somebody who's having trouble breathing. It's an order not to perform CPR when somebody is in cardiac arrest. Right? Sometimes people mistake that and they say, oh, there's, you know, it's DNR, so we're not going to give that guy oxygen. Well, if the guy's awake and having trouble breathing, he's not in cardiac arrest, so you would be giving him oxygen. So don't dwell on it too much, because it's pretty straightforward. Like if you were going to say, you know, I'm just going to go ahead and do something, everybody else that was there would be saying like, you're crazy, you know, you can't do that, don't do that. And again, if you're going to be operating inside the, you know, the Jewish world, you're just not going to see these forms. They don't exist. I mean, maybe in like the modern Orthodox community, like the very modern Orthodox community, people may have, you know, DNR forms and most forms. Usually what will happen is it's not before the patient goes into cardiac arrest. The patient suffered a cardiac arrest. Okay, there was no DNR filled in. They then survived the cardiac arrest, but they didn't come back 100%. They came back 10%. So now they're laying in a nursing home with very little chance of ever coming back. And sometimes then you'll see a family fill in a DNR because there's really no chance that patient's brain is damaged beyond, any chance of coming back. So then you may see a DNR being filled in that if the patient should go into cardiac arrest again, let's not put them through it, a second time. But, being in Rockland County since 1988, I'll just tell you that you don't see a lot of these types of forms in the Jewish community. Okay. Okay. So other things that we have to talk about, and then we're going to take a little break. The term gross negligence. So negligence is the same thing as you've heard of malpractice, right? You've heard of stuff like that. So gross negligence is the legal way of saying somebody did something completely wrong and they could possibly lose a law, if sued, possibly lose their lawsuit. Okay, so they have not done what should have been done, okay, and or they did something that was indicated the wrong way. So like they did a procedure, like they did surgery on a patient that the patient needed, but they did it so horribly that the patient suffered an injury. Now, to prove gross negligence in a lawsuit, there's a couple of things that have to be proven. The first things they have to say is that you had a duty to act. So what does a duty to act mean? A duty to act means that you said that you were on duty that day. In other words, you signed up for a shift and you said, I'm on duty. Okay, you are then obligated to respond. If something comes up, okay, and now all of a sudden you're not available to respond, and you make notification to whoever does the schedule in the agency and say, look, I know I said I was going to be on from 7 p.m. to midnight, but my kid's not feeling well and my wife says I can't leave the house, so you got to find somebody else to cover. Then you don't have a duty to act. But if you agreed to respond to calls during a certain period of time, okay, then you have a duty to act. Now, where it gets a little confusing is, say, in the hot solar world. So, hot solar does have fixed shifts for people, especially on weekends. But let's say like during the daytime, there's not really a fixed shift, right? People who are available in the area, kind of are available. So now you get a call, okay? Call goes over to radio and it's, I don't know, it's somebody's neighbor, some hot solar member's neighbor, okay? And he doesn't like that neighbor, okay? And he just decides not to go. But at the same time, he's got his hot solar jacket on. He's got his hot solar radio hanging off his belt on the highest possible volume, so the whole neighborhood hears it. He's got a car with 72 lights on it and 6 stickers, and all this stuff. So he's clearly advertising that he's an EMT and he's a member of the EMS agency for that area. And he walks out of his house and drives away, even though he knows that person just called for the ambulance. It could be argued by all that advertising that he's doing that he actually has a duty to act, because of the fact that during that period of a day, there are no set units on. There's nobody agreeing to respond. Everybody kind of says, if I'm available, I'll respond. But he's running around advertising that he's available. That's the same problem with like having EMT license plates. Like I know a lot of you want to run around as soon as you get your EMT card and you want to go out and get EMT license plates. I've been doing this 35 years. I've never had EMT license plates because you're kind of advertising who you are. So like now you're driving down the road, there's a car accident and you pull up to it and there's 2 carloads of people that you don't really feel comfortable getting out of in front of them because they look a little dangerous, and you just drive away. And they say, well, that guy had EMT license plates and he didn't stop to help us. So again, you probably had a duty to act. If you stopped, you saw an accident, you're advertising that you're an EMT, and you kind of, stopped and then drove away. So you just have to, realize that. It's not a problem if your wife borrowed your car and she's not an EMT and, she drove past an accident scene, because if anything comes of it, you weren't in the car, right? So, I mean, that's not a problem. But, if you're advertising that you have training and certification, and then you don't offer that to someone, somebody could make that argument, okay? So the first thing is they have to prove you had a duty to act. Really what it comes into is when people sign up for shifts. That's when you have to be very, very careful. When you obligate yourself to be on for a certain period of time and then you don't do it. So you said, I'm going to be on from midnight to 8 a.m. A call comes in and you're sound asleep, you don't hear it. You technically had a duty to act. So that's the first thing that they have to prove, that you had a duty to act, that you agreed to be on duty. The second thing is that you breached that duty. Now, you could breach that duty in 2 ways: that you don't respond, okay, or that you didn't, okay, provide the standard of care. If you remember at the very beginning when we started talking, the standard of care is how another EMT with the same training as you would have treated that patient. So whatever, you go to somebody's house, they're having trouble breathing, you take them all the way to the hospital, you never put them on oxygen. You technically didn't provide the standard of care, because the standard of care for somebody having trouble breathing, 99.9% of the time would be to give them oxygen. So, I mean, I'm using very general terms. So you could see how it's already becoming a little hard to prove this, because, what EMT is going to respond to somebody who's having trouble breathing and not put them on oxygen unless they really are incompetent, right? But anyway, we'll go on. Okay. Then after they prove the first things, that you had to respond and that you breached that duty somehow, you didn't do the right thing by the patient, they have to prove that there was an injury to the patient, but because you didn't do what you were supposed to do and that you were the cause of it. So they have to, in other words, you didn't put that patient on oxygen. That's fine. Now they have to prove, because you didn't put that patient on oxygen, there was a problem that the patient suffered because of the fact that you didn't do what you're supposed to do. So you can see how now it really becomes hard to prove gross negligence, especially for EMS. I mean, if you pretty much come to a patient and take them to the hospital, it would be impossible to be charged with gross negligence. The time people run into problems is when they come to scenes where patients are asking to go to the hospital, and they actually talk them out of going to the hospital. Oh, you don't need to go. You're fine. Don't worry about it. Why do you want to go to the hospital? There's all sick people there. That's where people kind of, get into trouble, where they're kind of being lazy and they're kind of talking people out of going in the hospital. Again, in the Jewish world, you're a little safe because, believe it or not, I think I might even said this to you, for some reason in the Jewish world, they call the ambulance to tell them that they don't have to go to the hospital, or to make them better so they don't have to go to the hospital. So it's not usually too much of a problem. And again, to get sued, in the Jewish world, a Jewish guy, ambulance EMT, getting sued by another Jewish person, again, is not so common, right? So, but just to understand from a state exam standpoint that these questions, could be asked. Now, you could buy insurance, right? So for an EMT who's not doing it for pay, to get coverage for malpractice, for gross negligence, probably would cost you less than $100 a year. So I've always had it, I even have an additional policy that covers me as an instructor, so that if you say, I didn't treat this patient this way because Frank didn't teach me to do it, and I get dragged into your lawsuit, I have insurance to cover me for that. So now, again, it's 35 years of doing this. I've never really saw. There was a case years and years ago up in the North Rockland area where the ambulance took a very, very long time to respond to a patient in cardiac arrest. And then every single person on the ambulance that responded, there was no EMTs, and everybody who responded didn't know how to do CPR the right way. And it was so obvious to the family that they didn't know how to do CPR. They were arguing amongst themselves that the family knew something was up, and they actually sued, and it turned out that nobody had a valid CPR card. So I don't know whatever came of it, if they settled out of court or anything like that, because most medical lawsuits get settled out of court, which means that, the lawyer defending you realizes you screwed up so bad that they just say, okay, let's cut our losses. Let's not let this go before a jury, and let's offer them, $50,000 to make it go away. And they have the right to do that, just to kind of like say, okay, let's just make it go away. We don't want to take a chance on this going to a jury, and the jury decides you're entitled to $5 million. We'd rather cut our losses and pay $50,000. So, but if you didn't have malpractice insurance, then it's all on you, unless your agency that you belong to has malpractice insurance. So you just have to realize that. So for most people, most of the ambulance corps in Rockland County, I'm sure, have malpractice insurance. But that's something people should think about. They should ask before they join. Do you guys actually have malpractice insurance, and how much, coverage do you have? Okay. So there's a term also, like we had in locum parentis before, and we said the parent's not present. This over here, this res ipsa loquitur, says that thing speaks for itself. So what it means is that in court, they're going to say this incompetence, this gross negligence is just so obvious that it speaks for itself. So what you did, like, okay, the patient had a broken leg, you told them to walk to the ambulance. So it speaks for itself that what you did is so wrong. So that's what that kind of concept is. This they don't really ask on the state exam. Okay, so let's just review again. Duty to act. So a duty to act means you had an obligation to provide patient care because you agreed to be on duty, right? So a lot of times it's confusing. So duty to act is not always clear, I wrote. So you're off duty, okay, but yet you're wearing your uniform. or you're wearing your hot solo coat, or you got stickers on your car, or you got an EMT license plate, or you got a light bar on your roof. Okay, so you're kind of advertising, but you're not really on duty. So that would be something where it would be really up to the courts to decide, the jury to decide, are you on duty or you're not on duty? So you don't want to get into that position. So, you know, like I have to be honest with you, like I don't even walk around in public with a shirt on that says I'm a paramedic. You know, like I'll put another jacket over it, doesn't have anything on it if I'm going to walk into a store. Just because you don't want people coming up to you saying, you know, the guy in aisle 4, you know, is laying on the ground, go help him. Because you just never know what you're going to get involved in and, you know, what your liability is going to be. So you walk over there to help them, you have no equipment, and the patient's in cardiac arrest. Now, what are you going to do? Stand there? So then you're going to run into a liability because now you're not treating the patient. So you have to be careful. Just be careful before you run around with, you know, a million things advertising who you are. Okay. So I also wrote here that you're on duty but out of your jurisdiction. So remember, you're only an EMT in New York State. So if you're out of New York State, you have no responsibility to do anything. Okay. But you are an EMT in the entire state. So any place inside of New York State, you're technically an EMT, but you don't belong to the agency that's covering that jurisdiction. So that's again where it becomes like a gray area. So now you're, you know, you belong to XYZ Ambulance Corps in Rockland County, but now you're, you know, upstate New York in the mountains, but you're running around with your jacket on that says you're an EMT. So technically you don't have a duty to act because you're outside of your area, but you're running around advertising that you're an EMT because you're wearing a pseudo, you know, a sort of a uniform. So it's not going to be clear whether or not you have a duty to act. So it could generate a lawsuit, and it would be up to, you know, the jury to decide whether or not you're advertising that you had a duty to act. So,
May I interrupt for a second? Can we have a break in the next couple of minutes?
yep, we can have a break, and let's just get through these next couple of slides. I think we only have a couple of slides, and then we'll take a break.
Thanks.
Okay, so I wrote follow local laws and protocols, right? So again, there's not a whole lot of guidance that way. And then I wrote follow your own conscience, which is, you know, you never really get in trouble if you try to do what's right by the patient. So let's say you do see something and you stop and you say to them, listen, you know, I'll stay with you. I'll try to help you as best I can, but I don't have my equipment with me. I've called for the ambulance for you, and I'm going to stay and keep you, you know, stay by you and help you as best I can. That patient's never going to turn around and sue you. You could be the worst EMT, the worst doctor in the world, but if you're nice to the patient and the patient feels like you have their best interests in mind, you're never going to get sued. Trust me. I've seen people, you know, that really were rendering horrible care, but they were nice to the patient, and the patient couldn't care less that the care was horrible. All they knew was that they were having an emergency and this person was nice to them and came to help them. Okay. Now, abandonment is an important term to know for this chapter. So when you abandon somebody, it means that you don't take care of them, right? Like you're not with them anymore. So just quickly, there's 2 ways that we run into problems with abandonment. So the first one is you stop, you're driving, you stop, you start helping someone, okay? It's not your area, okay? And the ambulance shows up and the ambulance doesn't have any EMTs on board and you're an EMT. And you say, okay, you know, I'm done. Take the patient to the hospital, and something goes wrong in the transport to the hospital. What you basically did is you turned the care over to that patient to someone who had less training than you did. So you cannot do that. Okay. So if you start care on a patient, you can only turn that care over to somebody who has the same training that you have or higher. Now, in Rockland County, the paramedics come very close to, you know, abandonment every time they're on a call, because if they go on a call with the voluntary ambulances, and they say to the patient, they say, okay, there's nothing wrong. It's a broken leg. EMT's not to treat a broken leg. We're going to let the EMTs take them in and we're going to go back in service. That's fine. But if something were to go wrong en route to the hospital that they should have picked up on the scene, technically they could be charged with abandonment because they turned that care of the patient over to someone with less training. Okay. Now, the other way you could run into abandonment is that you do everything right. You take the patient to the hospital, take care of the patient, and your wife calls you and says, I need you home now, okay? And you don't take the time to actually give a report to the nurses or the doctor in the hospital, and you don't write up any documentation for the care you rendered. You just put the patient in a room and you leave because you got to get home. That's also considered abandonment because you didn't turn care over again, to somebody with your level of training or higher. Now, even if you went over to the desk and said to the secretary, oh, there's a patient in room 2 with chest pain, again, that secretary doesn't have your level of training or higher. So you get that concept of what I was just talking about. So what does it mean? It means that once you start care, you can turn that care over to somebody else, but that person has to have the same level of training that you do or higher. You can't turn it over to somebody who's less trained than you. And also you have to give a verbal and written report when you get to the hospital. Okay. So any questions on that? Because that's definitely something that's always on the test. Now, everybody talks about Good Samaritan laws and everything like that, you know, which kind of protect people who are not getting compensated. But all they do, okay, is offer you some slight immunity from liability, but they don't protect you from gross negligence or criminal action. So again, don't depend on Good Samaritan laws. Good Samaritan laws are for non-medically trained people who try to stop and help someone. You're going to have medical training. You're going to have passed a state exam. You're going to have a certification from the state saying you're trained to be an EMT. So really, the Good Samaritan laws don't really cover you just by the fact that you're a volunteer and you're not being paid for it. People think because they're volunteering and they're not being paid for it, they can't be sued, and it's not true, at least in New York State. Okay, couple things and then we're done. So I wrote here, you arrive on the scene of a patient in cardiac arrest. The family says she has a DNR, but they don't know where it is. What will we do? So do we start CPR on that patient or do we not start CPR on that patient?
Yes.
Yes, we start?
Yes.
Yes, we start because why? Because we did not see the DNR, right? So there could truly be a properly filled out DNR, but unless we see it, we have to pretend there's not one and we start CPR. Now, if they brought it, once we started CPR, then technically we stop, okay? Any questions on that one? So the second one I wrote is you're off duty, arrive at the scene of a vehicle crash.
It's not CPR. How can you stop?
What's that?
You're middle already. Why would you stop if you start already?
Because they presented you, I said to you, if you started it because they didn't have the DNR and now they bring you to DNR and it's properly filled out, you have to stop. That's what I said a little while ago, right? So again, if they hear the first question itself says that the family said they had a DNR, but they don't know where it is. So somebody answered correctly that you start CPR. That's right. Then I added a curveball to it and I said, once you started CPR, now they did bring the DNR and it was properly filled out. What do you do? And you actually have to stop CPR because now they presented you with a properly filled out DNR. So you have to stop. Okay. And listen, I know this sounds strange. I know this is all weird stuff, but you have to believe me, this is the law. Okay. And I think you know from your time, you know, being an adult that the law doesn't always make sense. Okay. So the second question says you're off duty and arrive at the scene of a crash. Police and EMS have not yet arrived. Are you legally obligated to stop and render aid? Okay. So you're driving by, you see a car accident, you have EMT plates on, you have an EMT jacket on. Do you have to stop? Probably yes. Okay. Probably yes. If you're outside of New York State, probably not. Okay, but inside of New York State, you probably have a responsibility to stop. Again, you can't say 100% if you're outside of your area where you agree to be an EMT, but to be on the safe side, you're probably better off to stop. Okay. Okay, let's take a break right here because I realize there's a couple more slides. So let's take a break. It is 9:08. Why don't you guys come back around 9:20 and we'll pick up with this. Okay.
Thank you.
Break.
Can I still ask a question?
Yep. Give me a second. I just want to. Well, if we're going to ask questions, I won't pause. So, does anybody have a question? Go ahead.
Yeah, you just mentioned to stop if there's an accident and I happen to pass by. Is that only because I have a jacket or something on, or even when I go to a trip, no jacket, no tools,
so there's a big echo. There's a big echo when you're talking, so I can't hear you clearly.
Is it better now?
Yes.
Okay, you just mentioned that if I pass by in New York State, an accident scene, I should rather stop. Let's say if I'm in a vehicle with no medical equipment, nothing.
So if I'm saying if you're advertising you're an EMT, so if you're in your I don't know, your parents' car, there's no license plate, there's no light bar, there's nothing that identifies you having training, you have no legal obligation. You may have what's called a moral obligation, which is that, you know, listen, you see a car accident, you're an EMT, you know, morally, you probably should help the person, right? That's why you became an EMT. But legally, you have no responsibility. But I'm just saying, if you're one of these guys, I mean, you know, listen, we live in Rockland County. You see there's, what, 10,000 cars driving around with EMT plates and light bars and this and that. Half of them don't even belong to an agency, right? So technically, they shouldn't even have a light bar, because to have a light, just because you're an EMT doesn't entitle you to have red lights and sirens. You have to belong to an agency, and that agency has to give you permission to have red lights and sirens. So the average volunteer ambulance corps outside of Hatzola doesn't let their members drive around with red lights and sirens, because they have to issue a certificate. Now, the other thing you need to remember if you drive around red lights and sirens is that your car insurance may not cover you if you get into an accident. But anyway, going back to what you said was that, all I said was that if you're advertising that you are an EMT, just to be 100% on the safe side, you know, I would stop. But if you're not, if there's no way anybody knows you're an EMT or anything like that, then no, you don't have no obligation to stop. And you may not even have a legal responsibility just because you have EMT plates on and stuff like that. But
If there is already any responders at the scene, do you have any obligation, if you're on duty, to stop anyways?
what did you say?
Get to a car accident and there are people on scene already. They have some EMTs on scene.
No,
Do
you
I
have no
have to stop,
Nope. If there's already people rendering care, you didn't have to stop.
even if I'm on duty?
Well, again, is it your area or not your area? If it's your
It's
area,
my area.
Okay.
Let's say even if it's my area, but I get there and I see that people are taking care of the scene already. Have any obligation staying?
you probably don't have to stop, but I would at least say you probably should just say to them, do you need help with anything? Like this happens to me all day long, right? So I live in Rockland County. I work in Rockland County, right? And I'm driving around Rockland County. So I'll see the paramedics on the side of the road. Could I drive right by them? Probably. But think about it, I'm their boss. So, you know, they know what my vehicle looks like. So, you know, I usually will stop for a second and just say, you guys need help with anything? And, you know,
I
obviously,
understand that's the normal way of responding, but I'm just saying if there's any obligation, if I could get sued, anybody could come after me, there's no obligation.
no, if there's somebody there caring for the patient, then you have no obligation to stop. In fact, you know, certain police departments would have a fit if you stopped, right? Like, there's already people here, why are you stopping?
Can they send you away or they?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You have no, I mean, the police, if you are not the responding agency and you show up on a scene, you could actually wind up getting arrested and have your car towed. So I had that on the thruway. I was on the thruway at a car accident. The ambulance, the local volunteer ambulance was not responding. And KJ was coming back from the city on a transport. They stopped. They came over and said, hey, you know, can we help? And stuff like that. Do you need anything? And the state trooper started having a fit. And I said, whoa, whoa, whoa. I said, listen, we've been sitting out here for 15 minutes. There's no ambulance, has even signed in yet. And these guys are willing to, you know, take the patient to the hospital, you know, relax. And, you know, he's like, well, you know, they don't have a license to operate on the thruway. I said, they have a license to operate in the whole state. I said, so relax. You don't know what you're talking about. And I don't want to get involved in the politics of it. So let's just, you know, let me handle the ambulance part of it. You handle the, you know, the accident investigation. And, you know, KJ ran the patient up to Orange Regional Medical Center. So,
Police do have a right to send you away
if you are not supposed to be there, you have no, in other words, you're just buffing it. You're just showing up. Absolutely. Absolutely. Now,
No,
again,
if I'm off duty, just on the thruway and there's an accident, it's not my district. I have nothing to do with that area. And I see an accident and I want to stop. The police tell me to leave.
you have to leave.
I have to leave.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, if you have no reason to be there, no legal reason to be there, the police can order you to leave. Now, I'll just say one thing. If the cop's standing there with his hands in his pocket and there's no ambulance there, there's nobody helping, most cops would say, well, I'd rather have you, you know, babysit the patient for me so I could write the report up than me have to stand there making excuses why the ambulance isn't here yet. But, you know, you can get people, who just, you know, have a bad attitude. You know, you can get a cop who has a bad attitude. You know, just like when, you know, there's different people, you know, sometimes people have a bad day. So, but legally, a police officer can order you. I mean, yeah, absolutely, a police officer can order you not to be there. You have no reason to be there.
Even you first responder?
I'm sorry?
Even you first responder?
What does that mean? Your first, were you dispatched there or you just drove past it?
No, just past it to before the cops.
No, so if you arrive before the cops, then obviously, no, you could start doing what you need to do. And if the cops come, they're probably not going to say to you, oh, we have the ambulance coming, you could leave. Because you could just say to them, listen, I can't leave because there's nobody here with any medical training, and I'm not allowed to leave until the ambulance comes. So once the ambulance comes, I'd be happy to leave, but legally I can't leave until somebody else with medical training comes.
So that means if let's say for instance, summertime, there's constantly accident from 17. So should I stop or I shouldn't? That's my question.
So again, are you driving around in a vehicle advertising yourself as an EMT?
Okay, yes.
Okay. So
So I
then,
have to stop.
so if you're driving around advertising yourself an EMT and you're going past the accident at 90 miles an hour, I don't think anybody's gonna know you're an EMT. But if you do this slow roll by and kind of check the scene out and then you drive away quickly, it's kind of looking like you saw what was going on and you chose to ignore it. Now, is there somebody out there videotaping everything that's going on? No. So are you probably going to get sued? No. But I'm just saying, all I'm pointing out is that if you're going to be this type of guy, okay, who's going to drive around in a vehicle that looks like it's a first response vehicle, you just have to realize that with that becomes, a liability if you choose not to stop.
So if I did stop and I started care, so do I stop when the locals show up or?
Yes. Yeah. You basically, when the ambulance shows up, you would say to them, this is what happened. This is what I got. This is what I did. Do you need me to help? And if they say no, say, okay, thank you very much. And you leave. Now, if you want to do it 100% right, you would have to say to them, like if nobody shows up with an EMT patch on, you'd have to say, do you have an EMT on the ambulance? Now, technically in New York State, an ambulance cannot respond unless there's an EMT on board. Some people will respond with the ambulance with a driver and have the EMT meet them at the scene. So if the ambulance shows up and there's no driver, there's no EMT because they're not there yet, then technically you would have to stay with the patient until the EMT arrives. So that happened to me on, what's this now? This is Thursday night on Monday night. So Monday night I worked an overtime shift and I got a psych patient walking in the roadway. So the guy was whatever. He was having a little issue. He wanted to go out and have a walk and the cops found him and he wanted to go up to the hospital. So I was standing there waiting with the cops for the ambulance. It took a while and the ambulance shows up and it was just a driver. So I said to him, do you have an EMT? So he said, yes, the EMT is responding from their house. They'd probably be here in about 10 minutes. So we waited 10 minutes. The EMT came. He parked his car on the side of the road. He got in the back of the ambulance for the patient. They took him off to Orange Regional Medical Center. So, now if that EMT didn't show up, I would have been stuck going in with that patient because the driver had driver couldn't drive and be the EMT, but he wasn't even an EMT. But I'm saying, you have to have two people on an ambulance. So if it was just a driver, I would have been stuck going in with that patient.
How did you do that? You're a paramedic.
Why not? I can't go in the back.
Oh, so you did end up going in the back.
No, I'm saying the EMT showed up, but if he did not show up, I would have had to go in with that patient.
Totally. You're a paramedic. The EMT is a lower level.
Yeah.
So how could you leave and leave a patient and have?
So that's what I was saying to you before. Like technically, every time a paramedic turns a patient over to an EMT, there's liability. So if that patient just had a psychiatric problem and needed a taxi ride to the hospital like this guy did, that EMT was more than capable of handling it. But if that patient, let's say I missed the patient was having chest pain and they turned out to be having a heart attack. And I just said to the ambulance, he's crazy, just take him to the hospital. Then if something went wrong in the back of the ambulance, technically they could say I abandoned that patient because I turned him over to somebody with a lower level of care. Now, that's all hypothetical. It doesn't really happen that way. But let's say, the paramedic's lazy and he never talked to the patient, didn't figure out what was going on. The ambulance shows up and says, it's 5 minutes before the end of my shift, just get this guy over to the hospital. And he never properly diagnosed the patient, never examined the patient. and they find out, you know, en route, there's something terribly wrong with the patient. So that could be considered abandonment. Absolutely. But doesn't mean that every time there's a call that the paramedic's on, he has to go to the hospital. He has to go to the hospital with the patient if the EMT cannot provide the care that the paramedic would provide. So in the case of the psychiatric patient, where it's just a taxi cab ride, you know, I mean, we could have put the guy in Uber and he would have, you know, it would have been cheaper ride to the hospital for him. He wanted to go to the hospital to see a doctor so he can get back on his meds. You know, he was not violent. He was not anything. He wanted to go, you know, himself. So.
If you stop by out of state at
What's
an
that?
accident scene, if you stop by out of state at an accident scene, obviously you're not considered as an EMT because you're out of state.
Right.
Are you protected under the Good Samaritan law?
So that would be a very, very good question because you do have training. So it would depend on the Good Samaritan law in that state, but I would say no, because the Good Samaritan law is really to protect somebody who has no training that wants to help. And you do have training. You're not certified in that state, but you do have training. You know what I'm saying? So you probably don't have a duty to act, but if you do stop, you probably do have to, you know, take care of that patient because you do have training. So you probably wouldn't be covered by Good
So your
Samaritan
training
law.
does count or doesn't count?
What's that?
So your training does count or it doesn't count?
So it's two separate things. Legally, you're not an EMT in that state because you didn't take their class and their exam, right? You don't have their certification, but you do have training. So again, the Good Samaritan law covers people who do not have medical training. So it's an interesting question. I mean, because you do have training. So it's an interesting question. It would be something really you just don't want to find out because it's something you'd have to hire lawyers to, you know, get involved with, and that would cost a lot of money. So, okay. Okay, so let's start up again, right? Because it's 9:21. Let me make sure the screen share is working. I can't find it now. Let's see. Okay. Okay, can you see the slide that says confidentiality?
Nope.
Yes. You can see the slide that says confidentiality?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so you've all heard the term Hipaa, right? So Hipaa stands for Health Information Portability Act. It basically was a federal law that was passed probably about 15, 20 years ago to protect people's rights to keep their medical information confidential.
That's 1996.
What's that?
It passed in 1996, went into effect in 2003.
Oh, okay, thank you. Okay, so it is a very strong law. I'll tell you, it's a very, very strong law, and you have to be very, very careful. And in EMS, we're not careful. I mean, think about it. You go on a call, and it's a great call, and you want to come back and tell the whole world about it, okay? Or, you know, I just tell you, we are not really good with guarding medical information. Now, let's say you have a bad car accident, you did a great job, and you want to come back and talk about the car accident in generalities. You want to say, oh, you know, car flew off the road, it was upside down, I crawled in the car, I helped the patient. That's not violating HIPAA. But if you say, you know, little Yitzi Frankel was in the car and, you know, oh, he broke his arm, that's violating that patient's confidentiality. So to talk about it in generality, just saying, you know, hey, I had a great call, this is what happened, that's fine. But if you identify the patient in a way that someone else could figure out who it is, okay, even if you said, oh, you know, it's the guy who lives, you know, the house around the corner from that shul, you know, the red-haired guy, you know, and stuff like that, then you're violating confidentiality. You don't even have to say the patient's name, but if they were able to figure out who it is, then you're violating that patient's confidentiality. Also, if you leave the documentation laying around where people who are not involved in the patient's care, you could do it. So let's say you fill out a form, you come back and you leave it laying on the desk, and 4 other EMTs who belong for the same agency now read it, you're violating that patient's confidentiality because they were not involved in the call. Now, you could review the call to talk about was something done right or wrong, but you have to black out the patient's information so nobody knows who the patient was. So you get the difference what I'm saying? You could talk about what went on in the call, what you did about the call. You just can't identify the patient who was on the call. Now, there are certain circumstances where you are allowed to identify. So obviously you're allowed to talk to the hospital, to pass care on to a doctor or nurse that's going to be caring for the patient for continuity of care. If you're the EMT that first responds, you could obviously, and you're not going to the hospital, you could obviously tell the other EMTs that are coming everything they need to know. You can tell insurance companies anything they need to know because obviously they have to pay for the care. If a patient signs a release, you can tell anybody who was on that release what's going on. You could tell the parents of a minor that's under 18 years of age what's going on with the minor. But if the child is over 18 years of age, you can't tell the parents anything unless they sign a waiver. The patient signs a waiver giving you permission. So, you know, you just have to be really careful because I don't know who spouted out the dates and stuff like that, but, you know, the fines are astronomical. You know, these are federal laws and they come with federal fines and even criminal fines for violating somebody's confidentiality. So you have to be very, very, very careful. I'll give you an example of how crazy people enforce it. My wife is a doctor, and when she was doing her residency training, you know, which is like after you finish medical school, she was in an elevator, big, you know, big, large elevator in a hospital with a whole bunch of other doctors. And some of them she knew, some of them she didn't know, you know, it was like there, and there was a group of 3 or 4 doctors talking about a patient in a very disparaging way, you know, in a nasty way, you know, just let that patient die, and all this stuff and anything. Well, it turned out that in the elevator was also a family member of that patient. And all those doctors are not doctors because of that. Basically, the hospital kicked them out of the training program. Now, whether they were able to go to some other hospital, I don't know, but they were kicked out of the residency program because they they said the patient's name, you know, in the room, and, you know, oh, that patient in the ICU, you know, the old, you know, patient, you know, what's her name, you know, in the ICU type of thing. They violated that patient's confidentiality in an open area discussing it. You know, people get so crazy as like, you can't email a patient's records to another person unless you're using an encrypted email program. But for some reason, a fax machine is considered safe. So it's like weird rules. So, you know, like a fax between 2 different fax machines is considered safer than emailing. So it's just very, very weird rules with it. So all you have to be careful about is that when you discuss a call, you don't identify the patient by name or any way that somebody could figure out who that patient is. Now, the other thing you have to be careful about is on calls. This is a typical call. You're you know, taking the patient out of the ambulance, and 5 concerned neighbors come running over. You know, what happened? What could I do? You know, what's wrong? It's my neighbor. You can't say anything. Can't say anything. You could say, you know, you can go and talk to their family, but we cannot tell you anything about the patient. So you can't say, you know, Chaim had a heart attack, or, you know, Shlomi slipped and broke his ankle. You can't say anything like that because you're now divulging confidential medical information to somebody other than the patient. Okay. You can't even tell a wife about a husband or a husband about a wife unless there's a waiver signed. So that's how strict the rules are. Okay. So that's just the way it is. You have to be, you know, you just have to realize, just like you wouldn't want people to know your business, it's the same.
Well, what do you mean there's a waiver signed? You get to a call and the husband has a heart attack, you don't say?
It's not anything that we would get done. In other words, it's not, when I say a waiver, so like you may have had to, you know, you may have done this, like, I don't know, let's say your wife is going to the hospital in labor, and there's 57 pages of forms, you know, you all filled out together. In one of those forms was that she probably gave you permission for the doctor to discuss the case with you, right? And the same
No,
thing.
but I'm saying when I get to a call, it's very, very tricky. When you get to a call, you don't tell the wife that the husband has had a heart attack or something.
So you could say to the patient, you could say to the husband, is it okay if I discuss your care with your wife? And that's fine, right? In other words, you know, you say to the patient, is it okay if we discuss your care, you know, with your family? Then it's fine. But when I say a waiver, you know, I mean, that's a written form. You've all probably filled out a waiver if you've ever had any medical care where you allowed other people to know what's going on. So yes, on a call, if the family's present, you could just say, you know, if the wife says, you know, well, what's going on? You could just say to the patient, you know, is it okay if we discuss your care with your wife? obviously they'll say yes, or maybe, who knows, maybe they'll say no, but I'm just saying, if they say no, then you can't. But if they say yes, then it's fine, So, I mean, there's even crazier things like, the patient's in cardiac arrest and the family's going to say to you, well, what's happening? So they obviously now know who the patient is because it's their family member, and they probably know what's going on. So, you could say in general terms, your husband, okay, his heart is stopped and we're trying to get it going again. That would be fine. That would definitely be fine, stuff like that. But you just have to be careful, especially, amongst ourselves, like you just have to, like everybody knows everybody in Muncie and Rockland County. So you just have to be careful. Somebody says, oh, I haven't seen the, Ruben and Shul in 2 weeks. Oh, I heard he had a heart attack. That would be a problem. That would be a problem. If you weren't an EMT, it wasn't a problem, right? But it's just because you're an EMT, you have to be very, very careful about that. So, okay. Okay. So again, we're allowed to share information with anybody who's rendering care to that patient. So that's not an issue. We're allowed to share information with whoever the patient desires to have us share information with. Let me give you another example. So we routinely get requests from the police department for our documentation on car accidents. Okay, so they want what the paramedics saw on the scene at a car accident. We don't give it to them. We tell them they have to either get a subpoena from a court, from a judge, requesting the records, or they have to get the patient to sign a waiver giving us permission. And then we never hear from the police department again. So, now whether the volunteer ambulances do it or not, I don't know. But a lot of people think just because the police asked for it, that you have to give it to them. But the police are not entitled to those records. The court can issue a subpoena that compels you to do it. So then, yes, you have to give it. That's fine. That's a judge assigned a court order. Yes, you have to do it. Okay. But your hands are tied. You don't have a choice. You have to do it. Or if the patient allows the police, they sign a waiver giving the police permission to have their records, that's fine also. Recently we had a case where the patient signed a waiver to allow the police to get the records. So it turned out the guy had a low blood sugar problem where he crashed his car. Okay. The police thought he was drunk, so they arrested him for DWI. And he was not drunk. His blood sugar was low, and that's why he couldn't drive. So he wanted to prove that he wasn't drunk by getting the paramedic's record, because the paramedic checked his blood sugar, okay, found out it was low, gave him sugar and woke him up, in the police station. So, the guy was already, in handcuffs in the police station, and he wasn't waking up, and the police called to have them checked out. So they didn't even call the ambulance to the scene because it didn't look like he was really hurt. He just had like a minor car accident. So they just thought he was drunk. So they arrested him, handcuffed him, and brought him to the police station. And he released his records because he wanted to prove that it was a diabetic problem, not a, drinking problem. So, it does happen. It works both ways. Sometimes people do want to release their information. So, okay. So that's the Hipaa type of stuff. Obviously, people can have medical identification devices on them. So the medical alert tag is a very common thing. It could be written on their wrist. It could be a necklace around them. It could be on their ankle where they write allergies or medications they may be taking. Sometimes people have things in their wallets. From what I understand, there's even like an app that people have on the phone. I have no idea how you get into the phone since most people most phones are locked. But there's definitely ways that people will list information that they have out there, and that's fine. If you're treating a patient, it's fine to see if a patient has any information. I personally don't go through people's wallets unless the police are there, and I usually hand the wallet to the cops and say, can you look through it and see if there's any medical information in there and stuff like that, just because you don't want any problems. I also don't take people's medications to the hospital for them. I don't transport people's dentures. I don't transport people's canes and walkers and wheelchairs, because if you take responsibility for any of that stuff and it gets lost, technically it's your problem. So like if you were to take the patient's, all the medications the patient has in house to the hospital, which is a common thing the ambulance does all the time, and the hospital loses all those medications, okay? They're gonna call up and say, you took all the medicines, what'd you do with them? And you're going to say, well, I gave them to the hospital. And the hospital's going to say, well, we never got them. So now the patient's lost $500 worth of medicine that's not going to be refilled by their drug plan for another 30 days or 60 days or 90 days. And they're going to look to you and say, well, what'd you do with the medicines? So what I just do is I either take pictures of all the bottles so we know what they're taking, or I write down the medicine and the dosage and, give that to the hospital. Or I'll tell the family, if you want to take all the medicines to the hospital so they know what your family member is taking, you can take them, but just please be sure that you watch them like a hawk, because if they disappear, you're going to have to buy all new medicines because your health insurance is not going to pay for more medicine just because they got lost at the hospital. So you have to be careful. Like, I don't take dentures. I don't take jewelry. People have watches on. I say, leave your watch at home or give it to your family member, just because you don't want to be responsible if something gets lost, that they're going to turn around and, say stuff to you. So you just, you have to be careful. People say, well, what should, should I take my wallet to the hospital? I'll say, well, take your wallet, but leave your money with your family, because you're not going to need money in the hospital, right? So we just leave your money so it doesn't disappear. It's just so nobody says, oh, I got into the ambulance with $300 and I got out of the ambulance with no money. It happens, listen, I could say at least once every 6 months, I'll get a call from some detective saying that, we were at a patient's house and the family saying that there was $500 missing or $100 missing, something like that from the house. Now, whether there is or not, I don't know. It never really goes anywhere unless, sometimes people have cameras in the house and they look at the cameras and they see nothing happened and they find out the money was misplaced. But you just have to be careful, so don't take responsibility for things that you don't need to take responsibility. It's not our job to transport a wheelchair to the hospital. It's not our job to transport somebody's dentures to the hospital. That's why people have family members and stuff like that. Okay, so again, medical identification devices are helpful, and when patients can't tell you what problems they have, to get an idea of what they have and stuff like that. Another example of medical information, we organ donor cards and stuff. So if somebody's an organ donor, it would be on their driver's license. It's just something. So like I think when we talked the other night, I said there's certain times we wouldn't start CPR and stuff like that, right? But there are people, I don't usually do this, but let's say you had a young, healthy person that died, right? And the situation is one where you wouldn't start CPR because, I don't know, they had a motorcycle accident. It looks like, they're dead or beyond dead, okay? But they're a young, healthy person. Some people would say, well, let's check their driver's license and see if they signed the organ donor card. And if they signed the organ donor card, okay, then they would do CPR and transport that patient to the hospital just so they could donate their organs. You know what I'm saying? And they're not doing CPR to bring that patient back to life. They're doing CPR to keep the person's organs perfused so that they could be harvested in the hospital to be given to other people. So it's an admirable thing to think about. I just usually don't think about that, as far as, if you have somebody who's a young, healthy person who's in cardiac arrest, we don't usually think of, keeping them alive just to harvest their organs. Okay, safe haven laws. So New York State has safe haven laws. What it basically means is that if a parent can't care for a child, they can drop that child, it's usually a little baby, off at any fire, police, or EMS station. And I think hospitals are included, and I believe churches are included, or houses of worship are included. They could drop that patient off, okay, and not be charged with a crime. But they have to actually turn that baby over to somebody. They can't just like leave it by the front door. So they have to turn it over to someone, okay, and then they could leave. But even if they don't, they drop it off at the police station, the police cannot arrest that person. Okay, so because in other words, they're making an attempt to make sure that that baby is safe, versus just like leaving it on the sidewalk because they can't take care of it. Okay, so there are safe haven laws and stuff like that. I've not heard of it happen in Rockland County, but I'm sure it happens in the city. Where
how does it apply to me?
So if you were at the Hatzola building, you were at the ambulance corps, somebody knocks on the door and says, I can't take care of my baby, and hands it to you. So you would take care of the baby. That patient, that person, you don't have to say, oh, I have to run after them and stop them or anything like that, because there's such a thing as a safe haven law, which means the police would not prosecute them for dropping the baby off.
But it's not my responsibility to keep the child.
It's your responsibility to care for the child because it's now a patient. You don't have to bring it home. You have to take it to the hospital. Make sure it's okay. No, you don't have to adopt it or anything like that. You just have to, make sure that it stays safe by taking it to the hospital. Okay. Okay, and then the last thing I believe is crime scenes. So obviously, unfortunately, we operate at crime scenes. Okay. our first priority at a crime scene is to take care of the patient. But if the patient's already dead, okay, then we have an obligation to preserve evidence. So what is evidence? Evidence is stuff that the police department would use to try to figure out what happened to that patient. So I'll just give you some examples. I one time went to a murder on Middletown Road in Pearl River, where somebody went into a gas station and stabbed to death in the middle of the night. It was a 24-hour gas station. They stabbed to death the guy who was pumping gas. So an hour later, somebody else came to get gas and couldn't find the guy, walked around and tried to look to find the guy who pumped gas and saw him laying inside the garage in a puddle of blood, and they called 911. So we were the first ones there. We got there before the police did, and we walked through the blood to take care of the patient. Then we quickly realized the patient was dead. There was nothing to do. So we waited. The police showed up 2 seconds later, and we left. So it just happened that that evening I was going to leave to go to Israel. So I was home sleeping, and while I was sleeping, this was, waiting to go, I hear like a siren outside my door, outside my house. So I get up, I look out, and there's a Ramapo police car and a Orangetown police car. So they come, and they said, sorry to bother you, but we need your shoes. I said, excuse me? They said, we need the shoes you were wearing because we need to make sure, we need to match your footprints to the other footprints who were at the scene to see if we can get the footprints of the person who did it. So I had to give them my shoes, and they, they just did what they had to do, and they eventually got them back to me, but I had to give them my shoes. So, that's an example of, gathering evidence and stuff like that. When you document, your thing, you would want to document the position you found a patient in and stuff like that, because that will help them determine, like, if you found a patient on the, face down, and you had to roll them over to assess them to see if there's anything wrong with them, right? So then you would want to document that you found a patient in a face down position, and you had to turn them over, okay? Because we're probably not going to roll them back in the position we find them, because it wouldn't be valid. You're not going to be able to put them exactly in the position that you found them from a crime scene investigation. So, you had to kind of contaminate the scene to take care of the patient, but at least you're documenting the position that you found the patient in and stuff like that. The other thing that's really important is if there's any bullet holes or knife holes in the clothing. So a lot of times when we have a trauma patient, we cut their clothing off so we can, better examine them. So if you have to cut somebody's clothing off and there's a bullet hole or a knife hole on the clothing, don't cut through the bullet hole or the knife hole, right? Cut around it, so to speak, so that you leave the actual bullet hole or knife hole intact, just again, from a crime scene, investigation standpoint, okay? And, try not to move every single thing and make a mess. Again, we're talking about not a patient that you're treating because you're taking them to the hospital. Then you do what you have to do and you get going to the hospital. I'm talking about that you find somebody that was a victim of a crime that's dead, and you're just making sure they're dead before you leave. Just, try to be as gentle as possible so that you don't contaminate the crime scene or anything like that. Okay, the last thing is special reporting situations, right? So EMTs in New York State, EMTs and above, so anything above an EMT law, first responders are not. EMTs and above are what they call mandated reporters. Doctors are mandated reporters, nursing are mandated reporters, teachers, clergy, everybody's a mandated reporter of child abuse or child neglect in New York State. So what that means is that if you suspect there's child abuse, you are required to file a verbal report as soon as possible after you drop the patient off at the hospital. Is 800 number you call, and then you have to follow it up with a written report within 24 hours, and that goes to Child Protective Services. Okay, if you fail to do that, you could be criminally charged with a crime for failing to report child abuse. Now, the only reason I bring it up that in the Jewish world, child abuse is not the issue, but the law of child neglect and the Jewish way of raising kids kind of conflicts itself. So picture this, okay? You go to a call, and a 7-year-old kid fell down a flight of stairs and broke their arm. And the parents are nowhere to be found because the 12-year-old sister of the kid is in charge of watching them. So the parents left the 12-year-old in charge of watching the kid. And the other kid fell down the flight of stairs. In the Jewish world, nobody would blink at that and say, oh, the kid's 12, he probably could watch the kids. In the legal world, they left a minor in charge of another minor. And that would be child abuse, child neglect. So technically, that's a reportable event for you. you would actually have to file a report on that because the parents were neglectful in leaving a minor in charge of another minor. Okay. So just, it's a weird thing, but it's, operating in, like I said, operating in the Jewish community. If you read the law, a lot of things that we would take for granted would actually be considered neglect. Okay. A child gets drunk on Purim and you respond and take care of that kid. Technically, that would be probably child abuse, because if somebody allowed that child to drink alcohol to the point that an ambulance was involved, that would be child abuse. Okay, so I'm not saying, how to handle it. I'm just telling you what the law is. Okay, so that just so you realize that you are a mandated reporter once you become an EMT, okay, of abuse and neglect. You're only a mandated reporter when you're working as an EMT. So if you're not working as an EMT, you're not a mandated reporter. But if you are responding on a call, taking care of a child, okay, just realize that there's a civil and legal criminal responsibility to, report it, okay? That doesn't exist with elderly patients, although we usually do report abuse of elderly patients. There's adult protective services that we usually do report. In New York State, you are required to report any patient with a gunshot wound or stabbing to the police department. We're not legally responsible to report sexual assault, but obviously, if the patient goes to the hospital would and stuff like that. And again, there's not a special form that you fill out when you restrain a patient, but I would warn you not to restrain a patient without having the police involved, because it's the best, having the police involved is the best way to avoid any kind of lawsuits or anything like that. So is everybody clear on the child abuse, right? That we are mandated reporters, which means that we're required to verbally call Child Protective Services if we suspect child abuse, okay, or child neglect, okay? And then we have to follow within 24 hours with a written report. It's an online written report where we basically document what we saw and why we suspect child abuse, okay? And that, the guidelines of what's abuse and neglect are, kind of open for interpretation, so that I tend to err on the side of caution and probably, report things that maybe are not so crazy, but depending on the clientele you take care of, some things that would be considered normal by that clientele may actually, result in, legally being considered child abuse or child neglect.
What did you say about elderly?
So elderly, there's no legal responsibility for an EMT to call Adult Protective Services. Adult Protective Services is the adult version of Child Protective Services. There's no legal responsibility. But there is what we call an ethical responsibility. In other words, we're trying to help people, so you can call them. The interesting thing about the difference between Child Protective Services and Adult Protective Services, Child Protective Services can force and take a child, right? They can force the issue and take the child away from the parents. Adult Protective Services, if you make a report, I'd say once a month at least, we make a report to Adult Protective Services about people, adults that really can't take care of themselves anymore, or, they're dirty, or they don't have food, or, we think something's going wrong. So we call Adult Protective Services, and they come pretty quickly and investigate. But if they knock on the patient's door and say to them, "Hi, this is Adult Protective Services. Can we talk to you?" And they say no, they will not call the police. They will not force the situation, because if it's an adult, just like the adult has the right to refuse care in a medical situation, they have the right to refuse Adult Protective Services from trying to make arrangements to get them food or better housing or anything like that, So it's an interesting situation. We had a person who was a hoarder, and their house was full of garbage. There was garbage everywhere. And Adult Protective Services couldn't do anything, but believe it or not, the Rockland County Department of Health, under the the hygiene law, the sanitation law, was able to say that was an unsafe condition, and actually was able to evict the patient from the house because it was so disgusting and dirty. And they were able to get the patient to go into a shelter and get psychiatric care. So where Adult Protective Services couldn't do anything, a different department was able to do something. So it was good that the report was made. But, the laws are, just think about it. Do you want somebody to be able to, as you an adult, come in and say, because you, I don't know, because you didn't shower for a week, do you want somebody to come and say, "Hey, we're Adult Protective Services, you haven't showered for a week, we're going to take you to the hospital"? So the answer is no. So that's why with kids it's different, because kids can't make decisions for themselves. So the law grants Child Protective Services very broad rights to protect the interest of the child. Where in Adult Protective Services, unless the adult has an altered mental status, they can pretty much make decisions for themselves. Okay, so we wrote over here, consent may be expressed or implied. So let's talk about that. Express consent, just so we remember, is that when we have a conscious, alert patient over the age of 18 who can make decisions for themselves, we have to tell them what? We have to say who we are. So my name is Frank, I'm a paramedic. We have to tell them what we think is wrong with them, what we'd like to do about it, and any possible consequences of doing it. In other words, I'm going to put a splint on your arm because I think you broke it. It's going to hurt a little bit while we're getting it in place. Right? So that's express consent. And then the patient has to say, yes, go ahead and put a splint on my arm. Okay, so again, that's from a totally legal standpoint. Those of you who are actually going on ambulance calls are going to say, that's baloney, that never happens. And I'm not saying you're wrong, but I'm telling you what's supposed to happen. Okay. Now, implied consent is a little different. Implied consent is a situation where the law allows us to treat patients who are not able to make decisions for themselves. That could be because they're a child under the age of 18. That could be because they're unconscious. That could be because they're intoxicated with alcohol or drugs. That could be because they have a mental defect like autism or some other intellectual impairment. So in those cases, if there's an emergency, we're allowed to treat them under implied consent because the law assumes that that's the right thing to do. Okay, so you get the difference between implied consent and express consent. Okay, express consent is the patient, like us right now, we can make decisions for ourselves. So before somebody can render medical care to us, they have to explain what they want to do, and we have to agree to it. Okay, where in implied consent, they can't because either they're too young to give consent or they're not 100% with it to be able to give consent because they're unconscious, they're on drugs, they're on alcohol, or they have some kind of mental defect. Okay, any questions on that one? Okay, abandonment, we said, is that we leave a patient after we started caring for them and before we turn that care over to somebody of our level of training or higher. Okay, so once we start caring for someone, we cannot turn that care over unless to someone who has less training than we do. The other way abandonment could be a problem is that we do perfect care. We take the patient all the way to the hospital, but we do not leave a written and we do not give a verbal report and a written report so that we ensure the continuity of the care, that the care continues once they get to the hospital. So any problem with that one?
What about the MCI scene when you assess patients?
Okay, so MCI scenes are usually pretty safe as far as lawsuits and stuff like that goes. Because you're talking, an MCI is a mass casualty incident, and a mass casualty incident means you have more patients than you could properly care for. So you have more patients than you have resources, than you have people to care for them. So the level of expectation is much lower. In other words, the level of what would mean gross negligence, okay, it'd be very difficult to reach that gross negligence cutoff because of the fact that the situation is just so crazy. Like you have 50 patients and 5 EMTs and you're doing the best you can do. So you don't have to really worry about any of this when you have an MCI type of situation. It's not going to pertain to that. Okay. Okay, confidentiality. Basically, we cannot divulge, identify a patient by name or any way they could figure out who the patient is, okay, to anyone who's not involved in the continued care of that patient. So it's fine, like I said, you're on a call, you could talk with it about your partner, you and your partner could talk to it to the nurse, to the doctor, and so on. When you get back to the station, you cannot discuss that call in a way that other people who are not on the call can identify the patient. You could talk about the call from an education standpoint, right? To say, hey, this is what we did. What do you think? But you can't identify the patient, okay? Now, you can release information to insurance companies, okay? You can release information to the courts if there's a subpoena, okay? But other than that, you have to get a release from the patient, a signed release from the patient, authorizing you to, turn the information over, okay? So I wrote here, as an EMT, you may be sued or held liable, okay, for any of these issues, okay? But it's pretty rare, for the most part, that EMTs are sued if they act within their level of training, which means they don't do things they're not trained to do, okay? And that they render the care that they're trained to do in a proper manner. That's the standard of care. In other words, that they know how to properly provide the care they're supposed to care to render. They know how to do the things that they're supposed to know how to do in a proper manner. And that's why the ambulance corps are supposed to have at least monthly training drills where people go over the equipment that's on the ambulance. Most ambulance corps don't do that, but they're supposed to have monthly drills where they go over, if you belong to a volunteer fire department, once a week, they have a training drill where they take all the gear out and they practice with it. Ambulance corps, for some reason, don't do that. At best, they meet monthly. A lot of times it's, just talking. It's not hands-on type of stuff. And I don't know why. It would be much better to, even have a weekly type of drill. And maybe it's because the ambulance corps do more calls than the fire departments do, so they actually, practice what they do on a more regular basis. But, it would be a good idea to take out some of the gear that we don't use on a regular basis and practice with it. Okay, we said at a crime scene, the care of the patient, if the patient is viable to be able to be saved, takes precedence over preserving evidence. Okay, but as best as possible, we would try not to disturb the scene. And the big thing they always discuss is not cutting up the bullet holes or stab wounds on a patient's clothing. Okay.
Are you allowed to discuss?
I'm
are
sorry?
you allowed to discuss a patient even if he wasn't on the call?
What'd you say?
Are you allowed to discuss a patient even if you wasn't on that call?
What do you mean, even if he wasn't on that call? Who wasn't on the call?
You wasn't on that call. You just discussed that patient with other people.
You can't identify it by name. So you could say, hey, there was a good car accident and this is what happened, but you can't say who it was that was on that car accident as an EMT.
HIPAA applies even if you wasn't on that call dispatch.
You cannot divulge medical information about a patient in a way that somebody else could figure out who it was. No, you can't. It would just be like if you're in the pediatrician's office with your kid and your neighbor comes in, okay, and then you run back out and tell everybody else in your neighborhood that that they said that kid has chicken pox. So you're now divulging medical information about that kid. You can't do that. It doesn't have to, you cannot divulge medical information in a way that they could bring it back to figure out who you're divulging the information about, period. Okay?
That's even if you didn't treat them, right?
So let's say you're not even the EMT and I don't know, you're working in a doctor's office. Okay, you're the secretary in a doctor's office. Okay, and I'll give you a classic example. So some secretary in my wife's office got fired because what did she do? She accessed the computer to look up her best friend's mother's lab work. So her best friend, her mother was in the hospital, and they had been calling to find out the patient's lab work. And they couldn't get anybody to tell them what the lab work. They said, the doctor will call you, the doctor will call you. The doctor wasn't calling. So they asked a friend to go into the computer that had access to the computer, right? Because she worked in my wife's office, to go in and tell them what the lab work was. And she did that. Now, how did they find out? There's software programs that monitor who accesses whose information. So that patient that she accessed was not a patient of the group that she worked for, was not a patient of my wife's group. She was a patient of the hospital, but she wasn't a patient of my wife's group. So by the fact that that person accessed the information and they knew that that patient wasn't in her group, they knew she had no right to be able to do it. So they called her in and said, did you look up this patient's information? And she said, yes, I did, because the family asked me to, and they fired her. So that person, wasn't caring for the patient, had nothing to do with the care of the patient, wasn't even a medically trained person.
But she had permission.
Doesn't matter.
The permission you can't give out.
She didn't have permission from the patient. She had permission from
the family. Okay,
the family.
I get it.
Yeah. So the biggest thing that you're going to run into problems with, I'll tell you, okay, is that you're going to come back from a call and people are going to say, what did you have? It's fine to tell them what you had. What you can't answer is, who was it? Okay, that's what you can't answer. When somebody says, who was it? You can't, you just say, I don't remember the guy's name. That's the easiest thing to say. When people say to me, who was it? I don't remember the name, you know, stuff like that. Okay. The other thing is just to be careful that you don't leave anything paper-wise around it identified. And most of the charting is done on computers now. And, you know, once you finish the computer, nobody can get in to see it except the people that are supposed to be allowed to get in to see it. So you don't have to worry about it. Once you sync the call and be done with the call, it's not your responsibility anymore. If somebody illegally accesses the information, that's not your responsibility once you do what you're supposed to do. But, you know, if you had taken written notes or something like that, or you took a picture of the patient's driver's license, you just have to make sure that you destroy it and that nobody can see it. So that would be kind of the information you would have to be careful about. Okay. Now somebody wrote a question and says, when a child's parents gives consent, does that fall under express consent or implied consent? So it would be express consent. Implied consent would mean the parents were not there and you're treating the patient, the child, under implied consent, assuming the parents would want the child treated in an emergency situation. But the parents are there and they give you permission. A parent can obviously give permission for a child under 18 years of age because the child cannot give permission for themselves. So then it would be express consent. So whoever asked that, that's an outstanding question. So that's definitely a thinking question. That's a great question. Okay. Okay. Okay, so let's do some questions. What time is it now? It's 10, and we'll do like another half hour or so of class, and then we'll stop. So scope of practice, standard of care, negligence, duty to act, abandonment, and confidentiality. Okay, so these all sound like great questions on our next quiz, right? So scope of practice is what you're allowed to do, right? The skills that an EMT is allowed legally to perform. Standard of care is how you should perform them. In other words, that you're rendering the care in the right way, you're doing the treatment in the right way. Negligence is when you don't, okay, do that treatment in the right way. So it's like malpractice. Negligence and malpractice sound the same. A duty to act means that you had a responsibility to respond to calls because you agreed to be on duty. Abandonment is that you started care on a patient and you failed to turn it over to somebody of your level of training or higher, or that you cared for that patient and transported them to the hospital and you didn't continue the care of that patient by giving a verbal and written report to the hospital on what you did. Confidentiality says that we cannot discuss, okay, anything about a patient in a way that identifies the patient by name, right? So we can't get anything that could talk about in a way that a patient can identify who it was, okay? Next question said, what steps must we take when a patient refuses care or transportation? So we have to go out of our way to try to convince the patient to accept that care and transportation. If they refuse, we could try to put them in contact with the doctors in the hospital. We could try to point out to them the risks of refusing care. We're going to make sure that we document it very well and that people hear us trying to convince the patient going to the hospital. And we would also try to see if we can get the patient to sign a refusal of care. Okay, but if they don't, they still have a right to refuse care even if they're not going to sign a refusal. And it says what type of evidence may be found at a crime scene, how should you act to preserve it? So who knows what type of evidence, but just to realize the big thing would be to, you know, minimize walking through puddles of blood if there's such a way of doing it, and not to cut through bullet holes and knife holes and stuff like that on a patient's clothing. Okay. So another one, we respond to a motor vehicle crash and find a seriously injured patient. He has no pulse, and you're about to begin CPR when someone says, don't do that. He's got cancer and he has a DNR. No one has the DNR at the scene. You start CPR and transport that patient. What do you think? So they say he has a DNR. They say he has cancer. He's dead. He's in cardiac arrest, but they can't produce the DNR. Do we have to treat him? The answer
Yes.
is absolutely, right?
Absolutely.
Good, good. Okay, so now we respond to a home where we find a 9-year-old female patient who is in severe respiratory distress, secondary to having an asthma attack. So we got a 9-year-old having trouble breathing because they're having an asthma attack. The patient's mother is present and gives you permission to treat the patient. As you're administering oxygen and albuterol to the patient, which are how we would treat them, the patient's father arrives and orders you to stop. What should you do?
Keep going.
Absolutely. It's actually a question on a state exam. Okay, as long as one parent gives you permission, you can treat the patient. Okay, so it's good. That's
And why
good.
would somebody say not to treat?
What's that? I didn't
Why
hear
would
you.
it be different not to treat, not to be treated? why would the situation be not to be treated at that age?
No, no, no. They're saying that the mother gave you permission and the father's telling you not to. So they're asking you, who should you listen to? So the rule is, as long as one parent gives permission, you can treat the patient. It doesn't have to be both parents. Okay? It could be the other way. It could be the father says to treat the patient, the mother says no. You would still treat the patient. Okay, so I'm glad you actually said that, because I had one class I did where I couldn't convince anybody that the mother could make a decision and it would stand even though the father didn't want it. Everybody's like, that makes no sense. If I say it, that's the way it has to be. So I'm glad you realize that it's not that way. Okay.
Can
So
somebody withdraw the permission he gave?
what do you mean somebody? If you started to give permission for
The
treatment,
mother said yes, and then the father came and said no, and then the mother says, okay, no.
then that's fine. But the only thing you have to realize too is that that may fall under child abuse, right? So if the patient really needs to be treated and the parents are refusing, you may have to say to them, well, listen, this kid really needs to go to the hospital and you're refusing to let him go to the hospital. We're going to have to call Child Protective Services because, this is really either child abuse or child neglect. So just to,
There's also a praxis. If somebody has a praxis and the praxis said in the beginning yes, and then it changes their mind.
So a proxy is different. A proxy means that, so right now, let's say all of us, right? All of us technically should fill out a healthcare proxy where we name someone else to be able to make medical decisions for us if we can no longer make medical decisions for ourselves. So normally you would name your spouse, right? So a husband would name a wife would name a husband. And you would say, if something happens, God forbid, and I can't make medical decisions, I've discussed it with my wife and she can make medical decisions for me. So that's what a proxy is. Now, for a proxy to go into effect, a doctor has to say that you're not capable of making decisions for yourself, which is why in the field we can't honor it, but that, it really is a totally valid legal document that should be honored. But it's just that because the doctor's not present in the field, we don't honor it. So what we tell the people is that as soon as we get to the hospital, then the proxy will be honored by the doctor because he's there. So we just have to come with us, bring the proxy, and then you'll be able to make decisions for the patient once you present it to the hospital. Okay. So any other good questions?
If the father says no, isn't it a child protected issue?
What do you mean?
If a parent says no to a 9-year-old child.
Getting care?
Yes.
Yeah. So, but again, it's not, this one wasn't an issue because the mother gave you permission to do it. Mm-hmm. So care was still being provided. It's just that, the father wasn't on board with it, which is fine. He doesn't have to be on board with it. As long as one parent is on board with it, it's fine. Now, if they both said no, okay, or if one changed their mind and you felt the patient needed to be treated, then that could be something that would have to be reported to Child Protective Services. Okay. Okay, let's finish this other chapter and then we'll call it a night. So it's 10:07. If we get to 10:30, just remind me and we'll call it a night. But I think we can get through this pretty quick. Okay. Let me just see. Okay. So this is now we're going to talk about the language of medicine, right? So it's a little confusing. Everybody could see the slides, chapter 5, medical terminology. Yes? Can everybody see this topic? Yeah. Medical terminology? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So I sent out all these handouts to you. That actually, I forgot to mention that. I sent out all these handouts today and I sent them out 2 different ways. So one is the way we're looking at it now in color, 1 slide per page. So if you have access to a color printer and you don't care about the money, you could print it out this way if you want a review from it. The other way I sent it out to you is where there's 3 slides on every page in black and white with room for taking notes. So that's usually the easier way if you're going to print it out and be able to, want to take notes and stuff like that as I'm talking, which would be the smart way to do it. Today I didn't get it out too early, but you have the ones now for the next couple of classes. Okay. Okay. So medical terminology means the language of medicine. Now, are you going to save more people's lives because you know how to speak the language of medicine? Obviously not. But, you're now operating around other people who speak this language, doctors, nurses, other EMTs, paramedics, and so on. So to improve your credibility, in other words, that to make people feel comfortable that you know what you're doing, you have to at least understand part of it and stuff like that. So in medicine, words usually have like 2 parts to them. So that's what we're going to talk about a little now. And then we're going to go through some common medical terminology that or common words that you're going to have to know as an EMT and stuff like that. Okay. So there's 3 parts to a word. There's a root, okay, there's a prefix, and there's a suffix. Now I know a lot of you have never heard any of this before and stuff like that. That's fine. But prefixes are letters that become before a word, and suffixes are letters that come after a word. So you're going to see that, you know, things have, the meaning of things change because of prefixes and suffixes and stuff like that. So that's what we're going to talk about as we go on. So like the word thermometer, right? So the root part of the word, the part of the word that means something no matter what happens, is therm. So therm means heat, means temperature, right? So a meter, you know, a meter is something that measures something, right? So a thermometer is something that measures heat. The term dys usually means that it's something is not right. And the word pnea means breathing. So dyspnea, right here, dyspnea means trouble breathing, breathing that's not right. Tachy means fast, so tachypnea means fast breathing. So, and this is all, I know it's going to make people crazy, but again, a month from now, 2 months from now, you'll be rattling these words off, and you know, you may not pronounce them perfectly right, but you'll be rattling them off. I will send you a little video clip. There's a word, a part of the body called the medulla oblongata. So it's the hardest thing for people to say. It's the part of the brain that controls breathing. So I always start saying it early in class, and you know, tease people, like, you know, try to remember how to say it and stuff like that. So it's not going to make you obviously a better EMT or a worse EMT to know how to say it, but I always try to. What's that? I'm going to mute everybody for a second now. So so anyway, I used to always say it in class and get people to try to say it and everything. So one year we had in class, we had a guy that was right off the boat from Yerushalayim, you know, and wore this very strange get up and garb and everything like that. And he really stood out in class and really could not speak English well. And he actually tried to get into EMT class the year ahead of time, and I wouldn't let him take it because he really couldn't speak English well. So he spent the whole year learning English, comes back the next year, says, you know, I learned English, and you know, I want to be taking EMT class. So I took him in, and you know, it was really hard for him to pronounce any word. So one day I get a little video clip on WhatsApp of him standing in, you know, Rockland Kosher in front of the vegetables, and he's videotaping himself saying medulla oblongata like 10 times, and he sends it to me. So I just thought it was, you know, it was really like the cutest thing in the world that this guy actually, you know, finally probably stood in front of the mirror for days pronouncing that word and actually was able to say it. I'm sure all the people that were shopping, you know, were wondering what the hell he was doing, especially wearing the outfit he wore. But, you know, I just thought it was interesting. Okay, so again, we're going to start throughout class going through and saying we have to remember what certain things do to a word. So we're going to have to know that tachy, like a tachometer in a car, tells you the RPMs that a car is going, right? How fast a car is going. So tachy always means fast. Brady always means slow. Okay. Cardia always means heart. Okay. Yes, somebody asked if he passed the exam. Yes, he did. So he was actually a Baal Tshuva, a son of a guy that moved to Israel, just like as a high school. He moved to Israel, became religious, and the father, and became a doctor in Israel, and for some reason became like ultra religious, and lived in that Mir Shardim in Yerushalayim and everything, and they wore the weird outfit and everything. So the father was actually a doctor, and the kid grew up, you know, obviously with medicine and stuff like that, and you know, but raised ultra, you know, religious, and had no secular education whatsoever. And then they somehow wound up back in America and decided he wanted to be an EMT, you know, so. But anyway, it was an interesting story. Every so often I hear from him. He's still floating around. He's up in the mountains somewhere now. So again, tachy means fast, cardia means fast. So when you feel somebody's pulse now and the pulse is above 100, really saying they have a fast pulse is not the most accurate way of describing it. It's more, the right word would be tachycardia. So yes, sure, as somebody else texted, you're all going to pass the class. Yes. We pride ourselves that we pretty much have 100% success rate on class. So everybody, if you pay attention, do some reading, you know, ask questions, you'll get through the class. Okay, so again, another thing that we just talked about, hemo is blood. And again, you're not going to remember this tonight, but as we keep on repeating it, the thorax is the way we say in medicine a chest. So hemothorax means there's blood inside the chest. Now, we're not talking blood going through the veins and the arteries where it should be. We're talking about that somebody has a wound and they're bleeding internally in their chest, right? So that should not be happening. So hemothorax is an example of a wound that somebody would have if they were stabbed or shot in the chest. You know, just again, just some examples. A cardiologist, right?
Like
So
internal bleeding?
What's that?
Like internal bleeding?
Yeah, like somebody was shot or stabbed, okay, in their, you know, in their chest. Yes, like internal bleeding. So just a term cardiologist, just so you understand. So you all know a cardiologist is a doctor that deals with the heart, right? So cardio means heart, logi means studying, and ist is one who specializes in it. So a cardiologist is how you put the word together for the person who, you know, is the specialist in treating heart problems. Okay, so I think now I have, here's some things that I wrote in here that I would say would be very important for you, okay, as EMTs to know. Okay, so when you see an A or an AN in front of a word, that is always going to mean without or not, that it's not there, basically. So the word systole, take the A off for a second. The word SYSTOLE, that means that the heart is contracting, is squeezing, right? So when somebody has asystole, like we talked about in CPR the other day, we said that is where there's no activity of the heart. So just by putting the A in front of the word systole, you're taking somebody who has a normal heartbeat and making them to have no heartbeat, okay? The word anti means against. So coagulation is like making a scab, making a blood clot to stop bleeding. So you've heard of anticoagulants. They're medicines that people take to prevent them from having blood clots, right? So an putting the word anti in front of the word coagulant means that instead of stopping bleeding, you're giving them a medicine to make it more likely they would bleed, but we're using it for a reason, a therapeutic reason, because they're prone to getting blood clots. So we don't want them to get blood clots. The other word you're going to hear a lot is bilateral. So lateral means, the word lateral means to the side, and bilateral, when it's BI, it means two, so it means both sides. So when you say somebody has bilateral femur fractures, the femur is the big bone of the leg. So if they have bilateral femur fractures, that means they broke both their femurs. Okay. Brady is the opposite of tachy. So here's Brady and here's tachy. Brady means slow. Tachy means fast. So a bradycardia, cardia means heart. A bradycardia is a slow heart rate. A tachycardia is a fast heart rate. Typically, bradycardia is below 60. Tachycardia is above 100. Okay. Contra means against or opposite. So an indication is a reason to do something. A contraindication is a reason not to do something. So when we talk about pharmacology, we talk about drugs that we give patients, and I tell you a low blood pressure is a contraindication to giving somebody nitroglycerin. That's what I'm saying. So well, nitroglycerin has the ability to lower blood pressure. So if somebody starts with a low blood pressure, you don't want to give them another drug that could lower their blood pressure. So before we would ever give somebody nitroglycerin, we have to check their blood pressure and make sure that the higher number, the systolic number, is above 120 millimeters of mercury. If not, then giving them that low blood pressure would be a contraindication to giving them nitroglycerin. Okay, so hyper means fast or above normal, too much. So hyperventilation, ventilation is breathing. Hyperventilation is somebody breathing too fast. Hypo means too little. So perfusion talks about blood flow, blood pressure type of thing. So hypoperfusion means that there's not enough blood circulating in the body. Okay, in a second, we're going to see the midline is an imaginary line we draw through the center of the body to divide the body in halves. Okay, so mid means middle. So midline is the middle line in the body that we use for anatomical purposes. Okay, so somebody asked a good question. Hyper versus tachy. Hyper means too much of something. Tachy means too fast. So hyperventilation meaning they're breathing too many times a minute. Okay, tachycardia means their heart is beating too many times a minute. So one's a number and one is too much volume, like they're breathing too much air. That's what it would be there. So that's a good question. Okay. Okay, so I think I have a few more. So again, we did this already, hyperperfusion. Okay, low blood pressure. I'm sorry, low perfusion or shock, right? Hypoxia. So oxia, O-X-I-A is oxygen. Hypo means low. So hypoxia is a low level of oxygen. Hypotension, specifically tension meaning blood pressure, kind of similar to hyperperfusion, but here you're saying that the blood pressure is low. Here you're saying the entire body is not getting enough perfusion because you see the skin is cold and the skin is pale. Okay, so again, this is not going to 100% make sense tonight, and please don't get frustrated if you're saying, oh my God, he's throwing too many words at me. And if you read the book, and if you call me up and ask questions, and you call up David and you call up Yankee and you talk to the instructors, everybody's going to be able to do this. Okay, I've not had one person, okay, tell me, you know, by the end of class, I mean, I'm sorry, I've had multiple people tell me by the end of class, I never thought I'd get through it, but I got through it. You just have to have the time to do the reading and to ask the questions. Now, some of you may not have the time. That's different, you know, and if that's the case, if you realize you don't have the time, then you should drop out and ask for your money back. But if you have the time to be able to put into it and you have the interest to be able to put into it, you can do it. You know, it's just going to involve, you know, a lot of reading, and obviously you have to make sure that your wife and your family is on board, because you know you're going to be taking some time away from family life to be able to do all this. And there's a lot of, you know, this is not the first class we've done. There's tons and tons of review material all in that Dropbox. You can listen to me until you never want to hear my voice again. Trust me. Okay, so bradycardia means a slow heart rate, less than 60. Tachycardia means a fast heart rate greater than 100. Bilateral means both sides of the body. Cyanosis, you're going to hear all the time, which is a bluish discolorization on what they call mucous membranes. Mucous membranes are the part of the body where the skin is the thinnest. So the easiest place to remember a mucous membrane is your lips, right? The skin on your lips is very thin. And you've all seen cyanosis where you saw your little kid in the swimming pool and their lips were blue, okay? So the reason their lips were blue in this case was not because they had trouble breathing and their oxygen level was low, because remember—
Cold water.
Well, I'm going to talk in a second. Hypoxia means low level of oxygen. So anytime you have cyanosis, it's because there's low level of oxygen. But when the kid was in the pool and they were cold, what did the body do? To conserve heat, it didn't let that much blood get to the surface of your body, because the surface of your body is where the cold water was. So it keeps your warm blood more internally. So since it wasn't letting the blood get to your lips, right, to the furthest parts of your body, it means that the blood had the oxygen. So since the blood wasn't getting to your lips, the oxygen wasn't getting to your lips. So you get the same cyanosis that you would see in somebody who's having trouble breathing and a person who's not having any trouble breathing, right? In this case, it's just that they were exposed to cold water. But that's the best way to see, at least for you now, to know what hypoxia looks like, okay? And a lot of times a kid in a pool will have lips bluer than anything you'll ever see when somebody's having trouble breathing, right? I mean, because they're really getting no oxygenated blood to their lips, where when somebody's having trouble breathing, they usually get some oxygen to their lips. Okay, bronchospasm. So broncho talks about the air breathing tubes, the bronchial.
Is the word cyanosis also a combination from the words? Or it's just...
Probably is, because cyan is blue, and osis I would have to look up. I'm not sure if that's like skin or mucous membrane, but cyan is the abbreviation for blue. Like, you know, if you have a printer and you have all those different printer cartridges, you know, the inkjet printers, cyan is your blue color, okay? So broncho is the breathing tubes, and spasm means they got tight. So when somebody's having an asthma attack, the bronchioles, which are your air tubes that go to your lungs, get tight, and that's why they can't have trouble breathing, okay? Now, just a couple other things. An acronym you're going to use a lot in EMS. So an acronym is an abbreviation for a bigger word or a series of words by the first letter of each word. So this is a new one we use, CPAP. So CPAP is pronounced like CPAP, right? It stands for continuous, so that's the C, positive airway pressure. It's a device we strap on a patient to help them breathe. And again, you'll practice with it in class, and you'll know when to use it and not use it as we go on in class. But you're going to, a lot of things in medicine are acronyms. It's easier to say CPAP than it is to say, take me out the continuous positive airway pressure device, right? So that's why we use it, okay? Again, you learned the abbreviation for DNR, do not resuscitate order, that people may have filled out in advance when they don't want CPR when they're in cardiac arrest. Now, we shouldn't use abbreviations and medical terms in front of patients and family, because they probably don't understand it. So when you're just discussing things around patients and family, okay, just speak in plain English. And when you're in the hospital describing things to doctors and nurses, if you don't know the right term, then it's better just to say, I don't know the exact right term for it, but this is what the patient was saying. It'd be, in other words, when you try to fake things, you have less credibility with people. So it's, listen, we're not going to know every single term in medicine. I don't know every single term in medicine, right? So there's no way that we're going to know every single word, and that's it. And the same thing like back in the day before, when we had to write out reports. For the life of me, I could not spell the word diarrhea. Couldn't spell it. Never remember how to spell it. So I used to write patient had loose stools instead of writing diarrhea. But now when we have an electronic computer-based medical records, it does spell check. So you don't have to worry about it anymore. Okay. So this last thing, how much time do I have? 6 minutes. We'll just do it, quickly, and then we'll start up with this again next. So anatomy, this is the start of anatomy and physiology. Anatomy and physiology is, I think, for everybody, the hardest part of EMT class, because I'm going to teach you now in a night or 2 or 3 how the body works. So the average medical professional spends months and months and months studying anatomy and physiology. And, now I'm going to train you in it in a short period of time. So this is, to me, the most interesting part of the class, because you're going to learn all the structures of the body and how the body works so that you could then understand when something doesn't work right, how you treat it. So this is really like the crux of it. Like you really can't practice medicine without understanding the anatomy of the body, where everything is, okay, and then how it works. So anatomy is the structure, the parts of the body, and physiology is how those parts work to keep the person alive. So, okay. So the first thing we have to talk about is that to picture a patient from an anatomical standpoint, from a structure standpoint, the patient has to always be standing in the same position, right? So what I'm saying is that whenever you look at a patient, okay, you're going to picture them in what they call the anatomical position, which is standing upright with their arms facing you, with their palms facing forward. So that when I say now the patient has an injury on their right arm, you're not going to say that this is their right arm. And you could see my cursor moving, right? You guys can see my cursor moving?
Yes.
Okay. So you're not going to say this is the patient's right arm, because it's actually the patient's right arm, not as we're looking at them. So the right side of the body is the patient's right side of the body. Okay. So whenever we talk now on test questions and anything, and I say to you, the patient's has an injury to the lateral side of their right chest, or their right thorax, right? Because the thorax is the chest. So this is their chest, and the right side, okay, is this side, and lateral is the side. So they would have an injury over here. Now, the other thing we just talked about is we said that there's an imaginary line drawn through the middle of the body, right? So the midline is this imaginary line that's drawn straight through the center of the body, right through the belly button. And the medical term for the belly button is the umbilicus. So your belly button really has a term to it, okay? So anything that goes towards the midline, okay, versus anything that goes away from the midline. So you're going to see that they're going to talk about things that go lateral, go away from the midline, okay, and things that go, I'm forgetting.
Proximal.
No, proximal and distal is closer and further away. Okay, it'll come back to me.
Medial?
Lateral and medial, maybe.
Medial?
Maybe it is medial. Yeah, you're right. Okay, so lateral would be going to the side, medial will be going to the middle, I'm pretty sure, but I'll go over it again. Now, the other term you see here is proximal and distal. So this refers to when you're looking at an extremity, if it's closer to where the extremity attaches to the body, it's proximal, and if it's further away from, it's distal. So if you were to say somebody had an injury to the distal part of their right arm, it would be the lower part. And if you would say it's the proximal part of the arm, it would be the upper arm. Now, I know you're probably saying to me, nobody's going to ever use these terms in real life in medicine, and you're somewhat right, but we do need to know them, because on a test they're going to be there, and people will say, like when you're in the hospital, people will use these terms. Okay, superior means going towards the ceiling, and inferior means going towards the floor. Okay, and then we had anterior, which is the front of the body, and posterior, which is the back of the body. So I'm gonna, I have a little chart of all these things I'll email out tomorrow, but just to start introducing these terms tonight, okay? So when we say the injury is bilateral, you see here, both their legs, their femur bones and their upper leg are broken. So that would be a bilateral fracture because it's on both sides of the body. If it's unilateral, then only one bone is broken on one side, okay? Another imaginary line in the body is called the mid-axillary line. So your armpit is called your axillary area. So a mid-axillary line, so that divides the chest, the front of the chest from the back of the chest. Not commonly used in what we have to worry about, so it's not a big deal, okay? The bigger one would be the midline, which was this imaginary line drawn through the center of the body, okay? So like on the last state exam, they said, which of the following describe the anatomical position? So that's the question. It said, which of the following descriptions is the anatomical position? So they said the patient's lying face down, the patient's lying on their back, the patient is standing upright with the palms facing backwards, or the patient is standing up with the palms facing forward. So the anatomical position is the patient standing upright with the palms facing forward. The other question they asked was that when the patient's in the anatomical position, are the thumbs to the lateral side or the medial side? Okay, so you're right, Yankee, it was medial. So are the thumbs to the lateral side or the medial side? So when they're in the anatomical position, the patient's thumb is to the lateral side because it's going outward. If it was pointing towards the patient, then it would be to the medial side. Okay. Okay, so again, anterior is the front of the body, posterior is the back of the body. The old way we used to say it was ventral and dorsal, but now they use anterior, posterior. So the anterior part of the body is the front, the posterior part of the body is the back, the superior part is the top, the inferior part is the feet. Okay. Proximal means closer, right? So we said the proximal arm would be closer to the body and the distal arm would be further away. The way you're going to see this used on a test is they're going to say the patient has weak distal pulses in their wrist. So their distal pulse in their wrist is down here. What is the significance of that? So a pulse site further away from the heart will fade quicker than a pulse site closer to the heart if somebody's blood pressure is starting to drop because they're bleeding internally. So in other words, it would be if I was losing blood, I'd still keep this pulse in my neck because it's closer to my heart longer than I would keep the pulse in my arm because it's further away from the pump. Okay. So somebody asked, you know, proximal is closer to the body and distal is further away from the body. Yes. Right. Okay. Don't worry about palmar and plantar. Nobody's going to talk about that, but palm, like the palm of your hand, refers to your hand and plantar refers to the bottom of your foot, but that's not asked on an EMT level. Okay. So now, at some point, as we do anatomy and physiology next couple of days, I'm going to tell you every bone in the body, okay? Because they're not going to ask you, you know, what's the thigh bone? They're not going to say the thigh. They're going to say the femur, right? So we need to know all the different terms. They're not going to say the upper arm and the lower arm. They're going to say the humerus bone and the tibia and the fibula, right? They're going to use the terms of the actual bones on the state exam. So again, tonight you're not going to know them, but as we go through it, you will get them and know them all. Okay, so just more pictures of the same things that we were talking about, you know, before. So proximal, closer to the body, distal, further away from the body. Okay, towards the midline is medial, away from the midline is lateral. Okay, towards the head is superior, towards the feet is posterior, inferior. To the front of the body is anterior, to the back of the body is posterior, right? So you see posterior to the back, anterior to the front, superior to the top, inferior to the bottom. Okay, so again, they don't really use midclavicular line, but your clavicle, you need to know your clavicle is your collarbone, right? So you see one here and here. So this is your midline. And then if you wanted to divide the body into even more parts, you have two midclavicular lines, which are lines that run through the middle of the clavicle on an EMT level. Don't need to know them, okay? Again, they're not going to ask you about the planes of the body, so I have no idea why I have this slide here, but I might have used this for the advanced EMT class. Okay, now this you do have to know. They divide the abdomen to 4 quadrants. Okay, quadrant means 4, quad means 4, so 4 sections. And the dividing line is the umbilicus or belly button. So you draw an imaginary line through the belly button and you divide the abdomen to 4 quadrants by drawing this imaginary line through the umbilicus or belly button. So what they're going to ask you, and we'll go through next week, is what organs lie in what quadrants. So like your right upper quadrant, okay, has your liver and has some intestine. Your left upper quadrant has your spleen and some intestine in your stomach. Your right lower quadrant has your appendix and lots of intestine. And your left lower quadrant mainly has your intestine, right? So again, you're not going to know it tonight, but by reading, you'll get it all down pat and stuff like that. So again, they abbreviate right upper quadrant, RUQ, and so on and so on. So on the state exam, they're going to say patient complaining of abdominal pain in their lower right quadrant. What would be your, most plausible, or your what is the patient's most likely injury? So again, since the appendix is in the right lower quadrant, patients who have a right lower quadrant pain are always assumed to have an appendicitis until proven otherwise. So you can see, again, it's a very busy slide, but when you look at it in a textbook, all the different organs, okay? And I will point out which organs are important for us to know and which are not important for us to know. So again, from an anatomical standpoint, supine means the patient's lying on their back. Prone means their patient's lying face down. We cannot assess a patient in a prone position. So if we find a patient in a prone position, we always move them to a supine position on their back. And when we did CPR, we talked about the recovery position, which is that if a patient is unconscious but alive, to prevent them from aspirating their vomitus or sucking their vomitus into their lungs, we want to put them on their side. From a medical standpoint, it doesn't really matter what side, but we usually go to the left side because in an ambulance, if the patient's on their left side, they're facing the bench that we sit on. If they're on the right side and it's a small, tight ambulance, they're probably facing the equipment compartments and we can't see them. But in the bigger ambulances, there is a seat on that side too, but on the smaller ambulances, there's not. So usually we put them on their left side, but there is no medical reason, right, to do that. There's, years ago, they used to think there was, and I know we lean on Pesach, so there was that belief going back in time and stuff like that, but there's no real medical reason because everything is kind of down the midline of your body. Okay, so that's supine, that's prone, that's lateral recumbent, okay? Fowlers and semi-fowlers talk about the position on the stretcher, right? So fowlers would be somebody sitting straight up. They're sitting in like a firm back chair, straight up, not a very comfortable position for people on stretchers. So on stretchers, we typically put them in the semi-fowler's position where they're kind of sitting with their legs on the stretcher, but they're leaning back slightly so it's a little more comfortable. So that would be like the semi-fowler's position on a stretcher, okay? So real fowlers would be sitting kind of straight upward. So this is like kind of semi-fowlers. We don't use the Trendelenburg position anymore where people are head down. They used to put people in this position if they felt dizzy because they said more blood would get to their brain. But what they found is that if they had any kind of stomach, if they were heavy, the weight of the stomach would press on their diaphragm, which is the muscle between your abdomen and your chest that you use to breathe. And it would make it difficult for them to breathe. And they'd also be more likely to vomit in the back of an ambulance. So what we do now is we keep them supine, flat on their back, and we just elevate their legs. We don't tilt the whole body in a head down position. Okay, so again, Trendelenburg not usually used. This is what we normally do nowadays is we elevate their legs slightly if they feel a little weak and dizzy and stuff like that. Okay, so let's do a quick review and then I'll let everybody be done with their night. So I said that the reason we have to suffer through this is that, like everything, medicine has a language, okay? And you're going to be talking to other people who use that language. So just to be able to converse in a way that people feel you're a competent medical professional, you have to at least know some of the lingo, okay? And we talked about that medical terms have prefixes and suffixes, okay, that change the meaning of a word, and we'll learn those as we go on because we're going to constantly use that. And within another week from now, when people start saying the non-medical term for something, I'm going to stop you and correct you at what the medical term is because we have to start speaking on what the the medical terms are and stuff like that. Okay, so let's stop with these 2 chapters tonight. Tomorrow we're going to pick up with the real heavy-duty anatomy and physiology. Okay. And whatever, all you can do is read, do some reading as best you can. If you want to not do the reading, if you like listening to me, then I gave you the links to the different PowerPoints I already narrated. Okay. And who knows, you may find stuff that I say this time that I forgot to say last time, or stuff that I said last time and I forgot to say this time because I'm definitely getting older. But whatever you have time to do. Okay. And if you don't get, if you can't do it between now and tomorrow night, just whenever you have a chance. I think all of those would be easily playable while you're commuting. If you can download them onto your phone and get your phone to play them and stuff like that. And, obviously if you have any questions tomorrow, you can reach out to me. I don't have such a crazy day tomorrow, so I'll try to get back to you. And that's it. So does anybody have any questions before we call it a night?
Yes, what chapter are we letting tomorrow?
The anatomy and physiology chapter. So you'd have to go and look. I don't know specifically.
Chapter 6.
Chapter 6? Was it 6 somebody said?
Yeah, I believe it's 6.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, it is chapter 6 in the 13th edition.
Okay. So chapter 6. And again, you're not going to read that. I mean, listen, unless you really are a speed reader, you're not going to be able to read that entire chapter tonight. So do what you could do, and we'll go over it nice and slow. And what's that? Basically what? Okay. So does anybody have any specific questions? Anything we want to go over? Okay. So now that everybody should be on the WhatsApp, I hope. So if you're not getting the WhatsApps, just let Yankee or David Fleur know, and they'll add you to it. So what I'm going to do is when people ask me good questions now and call me up with good questions, I will put it out on the Dropbox, because trust me, if somebody called me up with a good question, I'm sure we all have the same question. And I'll put what the question was and what the answer was, just so we all do that review. And whatever, don't panic. If you have the time to do the reading and you have the time to do the studying, and we'll get through this together, and don't feel bad about asking questions. You can ask me, you can ask Yankee, you can ask David. Yankee and David are very good that if they don't know something, they will tell you that, and they will, call me up and get the right answer and stuff like that. So, everybody.
Is there any flashcards for?
So I do have, what's it called? The kids use it in school. Quizlet. So Quizlet is a online flashcard type of thing. So I will send that link out tomorrow to Quizlet. It's a little confusing to use. So I did write an instruction thing on it, but Quizlet is kind of like a little flashcard type of thing where you do it on the computer. Now, I'm not sure if you could print them out and do it that way. And, if you want to spend money, I'm sure there is somebody somewhere that's made, if you Google EMS flashcards, I'm sure somebody's made, actual paper flashcards. Or you could just take an index card, and you could write, proximal on one side, and on the back side, you could write closer to the body, and then make your own flashcards or something like that.
Is this something, have you ever seen these?
I'm sorry?
You ever seen this?
See what?
You're probably seeing it the wrong way, but it's a book. It says EMT Medical Technician Flashcards.
Okay.
I ordered with the book. I don't know, did you see this? Or?
I have not seen it, but if you want to show me a couple, that's fine. So anyway, some people are texting me they don't have WhatsApp, but just reach out to Yankee. He's online right now. If you don't have Yankee's stuff, then just let me know and I'll get it to you. But I think Yankee's setting up the WhatsApp group, and he'll add you to it. Or if worse comes to worse, just text me or email me tomorrow and I'll send it to him if you have no way of reaching him. Okay, so everybody should use, because we do use WhatsApp for communication. Just me personally, I muted my WhatsApp because it just got so annoying and so noisy. So if you need me right away, just text me. I check my WhatsApp like once an hour at most. So, but if you need me for something, God forbid, right away, then just text me and stuff like that. That's not a problem. Okay. Okay. So is there anything else we want to go over? Any questions or anything like that? Okay. So it was good seeing everyone again, and I will upload this night's lecture to YouTube after it finishes converting over, and it'll be up there if anybody wants to review it. And again, any questions, just reach out to me. Okay.
Thank you. Good night.
So everybody have a good night.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank you. Take care.